The winds on my Gito do not scream, they whisper. Slow, glacial currents of ice and silence, weaving between ancient vault towers, shattering light against the crystal cliffs, and carving through the bones of anyone who dares to listen too long. It is not a world meant for children, but that is where he was born. Hego Damask, heir to the Damask holdings, came into the galaxy not with cries, but with stillness. His first breath was drawn in a room without warmth, without celebration, without love. He was a Muun tall, long-limbed and pale, like so many others on this world. But even among the coldest of the intergalactic banking clan, the Damasks were colder still. In that tower of durasteel and vault glass, where numbers were worshipped more than names, Hego was not raised. He was measured, assessed, adjusted. Every decision about his life, his nourishment, his tutors, even the length of time he was allowed to sleep was governed by quiet algorithms written before his birth. The legacy of the Damasks depended on precision. There were no lullabies, only ledgers. His mother, a calculating financier in the higher echelons of the clan, rarely looked at him. She believed parental emotion led to weakness. His father had died in a quiet power shift that no one spoke of and that Hego would later come to understand as necessary, expected. As a boy, Hego learned to observe before he spoke, and then to speak only when it could shift the balance of control. By the age of 6, he was reciting trade laws from memory. By 8, he was designing economic traps to collapse smaller holdings, and by 10, he had already orchestrated the quiet dismantling of a rival Muun family without ever leaving his education chamber. But there was something else, something they couldn't track with graphs or performance charts. A feeling, not rage, not cruelty, not even ambition, something deeper. When Hego walked, the silent bridges, between towers, the wind bent around him unnaturally. When others faltered in calculation, he didn't simply correct them. He predicted their failure before they began. His tutors spoke of genius, but there were moments, quiet moments, when he would pause in thought, and everything around him would still. Even the cold, even the wind. No one could explain it, and no one dared question it. The Damasks simply noted the anomaly, adjusted the data models, and carried on. But far beyond the tower, far beyond Mygito, something else had noticed. In the depths of space, the Sith had no use for bankers. But they watched everything, especially those who could twist power without a lightsaber. Especially those who could manipulate systems with nothing but their voice. Especially those who felt the Force without ever knowing its name. There had been many children born on Mygito, many Muans bred for influence, but only one made the dark side pause, and in that stillness, Hego Damask, a boy who had never known warmth, became the subject of interest for a legacy far older than his bloodline. Not because he had power, but because he used it like it didn't belong to anyone else. He was never held. The closest thing to affection Hego Damask ever received was correction. A slight tilt of the head when his posture slipped, an increased assignment load when his tone betrayed even a trace of arrogance. And silence, sharp, punishing silence when he asked questions no Muun child was meant to ask. The Damask estate was a fortress of routine. Its halls were soft-lit but empty, as though emotion had been cleansed from the walls. Every servant wore the same expression, every droid the same programming, every word spoken with clinical efficiency. It was not cruelty, it was control. And from the very beginning, Hego excelled at it. His mind moved too quickly for his mentors. He could see the outcome of any transaction 5 steps before it occurred. While other children played with holopuzzles, he created economic models that predicted planetary collapses. But what unsettled those around him wasn't his brilliance, it was his patience. Hego never rushed, never bragged. He waited, and in the waiting he watched. His mother, once a feared presence within the banking clan, became cautious around her son. There was something in the way he listened too deeply, too silently, that made even her withhold unnecessary speech. By adolescence, Hego had taken over many of the family's investment portfolios without permission. Not for rebellion, but because he knew he could do better. And when profits surged beyond all expectation, no one dared challenge him. Behind his long limbs and sunken eyes, behind the pale skin and unreadable expression, there was a mind that no longer saw things as they were, only as they could be controlled. Yet even that mastery didn't satisfy him. Something was missing, something beneath the surface of power. When he walked through the data vaults beneath the estate, with columns stretching upward into blackness and energy pulses humming like distant thunder, he felt it. A pull, a pressure, like the air was waiting for him to understand something he could not yet name. He began to spend more time alone. Longer nights walking the corridors of the vault towers. He watched how light bent around crystal, how noise vanished under certain frequencies, how people, even confident Muons, began to lower their voices in his presence. They said it was respect. He knew it was fear. And in that fear he found comfort. He stopped asking questions. He stopped trusting instructors. He stopped imagining futures outside the structure he had already outgrown. And deep inside, he began to wonder something dangerous. If systems could be predicted and people could be controlled, then what, if anything, was beyond his reach? He had no friends, no rivals, no desire for companionship, because the only voice that mattered was the one that whispered in the stillness. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent, it was curious. As if the universe itself had begun watching him back. And though he did not know it yet, this attention was not from the stars. It came from far deeper, a wound in the Force. An ancient hunger searching for someone who could carry its will without ever questioning its cost. The Sith had names for these rare minds. They called them instruments. They called them vessels, but in secret, they called them the most dangerous kind of apprentice, the kind who didn't need to be broken, only pointed toward the dark. The vaults beneath the Damask estate were colder than the Mygeetan winds above. Some said they reached the planetary core. Others said they were older than the banking clan itself, carved by ancestors who knew what real power looked like. But Hego didn't care for legends. He cared for silence. And in the deep, humming stillness between vault walls and suspended finance matrices, he began to feel something that logic could not explain. It started with patterns, shifts in light, the way gravity seemed to bend when he concentrated too long in one place. Then came the voices, not in words, in sensations. A tightening in his chest when someone lied to him. A soft pressure behind his eyes when danger approached. Moments when he knew someone's intent before they acted, not because of body language, but because the air around them changed. He never spoke of it, not once, because part of him already knew no one would understand. And in the dark of those endless data halls, the Force began to swirl around him, not in peace, not in balance, but in slow, deliberate awakening. Elsewhere, far from Mygeeto, agents of the Sith moved in secret. Not warriors, not cultists, but watchers. And one such observer had eyes on Hego Damask, planted within the higher ranks of the far, intergalactic banking clan. This servant of Darth Tenebrous knew what to look for. Unnatural intuition. Strategic ruthlessness, a mind unbound by attachment. The Sith did not seek power in chaos. They sought it in control. and Hego was control, personified. When the observer first reported the boy's rise not in rank but in influence, Darth Tenebrous dismissed it. But when he read the boy's models, when he reviewed the economic disruptions triggered by a child too young to hold office, he paused. Not because the boy was dangerous, but because he was useful. And so, the Sith did what they always did when they sensed potential. They waited, not to tempt, not to threaten, but to let the darkness speak for itself. And in the silence of the vaults, the whispers grew. Hego began to dream, not of numbers or systems, but of shadows without faces, rooms without exits, hands without skin reaching for him but never touching. He would wake in cold sweat, breathing slowly, but not in fear, in understanding. Something was watching, something ancient. And somehow, he was no longer watching back. He was listening. One night, while reviewing planetary credit flow indexes, he stopped moving. The graphs on his display blurred. The lights around him dimmed, and in the hum of the vault, he felt it. A presence, no form, no voice, just a sense that someone was waiting for him to notice. When his mother found him standing motionless before a flickering display, she called for a physician, but there was nothing wrong. He simply turned and said, "I understand now," and walked away. She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to, because in that moment, for the first time in her life, she feared her own son. Not because of what he knew, but because of what he didn't need to ask. Hego Damask had begun hearing things that only the Sith could explain, and somewhere in the stars, Darth Tenebrous began to make preparations. It came as a business offer, a meeting scheduled on a neutral moon, with no formal record and no official purpose. The kind of thing only the banking clan could arrange, and only someone like Hego Damask would accept without question. He was 17, but his eyes held the stillness of someone far older. No bodyguards accompanied him, no advisors. He left Megito with nothing but silence in his stride and a question growing in his chest. The meeting took place inside a dormant mining facility, abandoned by design, perfectly hidden, perfectly quiet. The one waiting for him did not give a name. He wore a mask. He spoke like wind through stone. He moved with a precision Hego had never seen before. And though no lightsaber was drawn, Hego knew this was not just a man. This was something else. The Muon boy didn't flinch, didn't bow, didn't run. He listened. And what he heard was truth. The visitor spoke of the Force not as religion, not as mysticism, but as structure, a system, an energy that could be manipulated like currency, bent like metal, broken like weak governments. He spoke of ancient orders, of the Jedi, and their failure to understand the true shape of the galaxy. He spoke of the Sith, not as monsters, but as the rightful architects of control. And then, he said a name, Tenebrous, and with it, a choice. "You already understand half the galaxy," the figure said. "It's time you learn the rest." No promise, no flattery, just an opening. Hego did not ask for time. He did not ask what was required. He already knew. Power does not wait, and he would not wait to become what he was meant to be. He extended a hand. The figure took it, and in that silent exchange, everything changed. He left the facility not as a banker's heir, but as an apprentice. The title came later. The training, the pain, the transformation, all of it would come. But in that moment, it was sealed. The Force no longer whispered. It spoke, clearly, sharply, and it asked only one thing of him: control it before it controls you. Back on Megito, no one noticed his absence. Not truly. He returned as expected, maintained his holdings, and grew his influence. But now, every decision he made carried a second motive. Every conversation had a second voice beneath it. He began funding obscure biological research programs under pseudonyms. He rerouted investments toward worlds forgotten by the Republic. He made enemies disappear without documentation. No alarms were raised, no questions asked. Because when Hego Damask moved, the economy followed. And when the economy followed, the galaxy obeyed. He was no longer waiting to be understood. He was preparing to be feared. Not with ships, not with weapons, but with knowledge. For beneath the cold crystal cities of Megiddo, beneath the vaults that once silenced his mind, a new voice had risen, and it was his. No longer a boy, no longer a Muon, not even Hego. He was something else now, something darker, something inevitable. And though his master had yet to teach him the name, the galaxy had already begun to feel the weight of Darth Plagueis. The ship was silent, not because it lacked crew, but because its pilot preferred it that way. A sleek vessel, blacker than the void, cut through hyperspace without announcement. Inside, Hego Damask stood near a viewing pane, eyes fixed on the streaking stars. He didn't ask where they were going. He had learned already that questions in the presence of his new master were a waste of breath. Darth Tenebrous did not teach in the way Jedi did. There were no lessons, no titles, no promises. Only demonstrations. The Sith Lord was unlike anything Hego had expected. Not a towering warlord, not a cloaked phantom from ancient tales. He was precise, methodical, cold in a way that even the Muons had not mastered. His body, though wrapped in robes, carried the shape of someone who had spent decades in laboratories, not battlefields. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was sharp, not cruel, but efficient, as if each syllable had already been edited 1,000 times before reaching air. On the first day, he didn't speak at all. Instead, he brought Hego to a lifeless moon orbiting an uncharted star. They landed in a crater lined with old metal, the remains of a Sith observatory long buried in history. There, Tenebrous walked alone through dust-choked tunnels and whispered to machines. He activated old systems with a wave of his hand. And then he turned to Hego. "You are not my equal," he said. "You are not yet my apprentice." Hego remained silent. "You are here to learn, and if you survive, you may one day understand what that truly means." That was the moment it began. Not a ceremony, not a ritual, a condition. Tenebrous did not train with sabers. He did not lecture on Sith history. Instead, he opened vaults full of failed experiments, living things caught between death and mutation. He showed Hego tanks filled with creatures whose midichlorians had been ripped apart and restitched. Some breathed, some screamed, some no longer recognized breath at all. "This is the legacy of power," Tenebrous said. "Not war, not conquest, but control at the molecular level." They visited worlds not marked on any chart. Derelict research stations once built by the Sith Empire. Laboratories hidden beneath crumbling fortresses. Biological archives kept preserved beneath volcanic crusts. Each place contained secrets, each secret a warning. And still, Tenebrous pressed on. He spoke of the Force, not as a mystical current, but as an equation. An algorithm of life, bound by blood and instinct, but still alterable. And slowly, as Hego watched, listened, recorded, he began to see it too. The Force was not just power, it was architecture. It had rules. And if those rules could be broken, then even death could be undone. Tenebrous had no love for Hego, no pride. He had chosen him not for his soul, but for his mind, because Hego understood economics. And in Tenebrous's view, the Force was merely another system to exploit. For the first time, Hego Damask saw the Sith for what they truly were. Not monsters, not sorcerers, but engineers of fear, of fate, of flesh. And in that understanding, something inside him began to shift. Not away from who he was, but toward what he was becoming. He did not feel horror. He did not feel doubt. Only a quiet and growing curiosity. Their journey through the Outer Rim did not follow the paths of merchants or explorers. Darth Tenebrous had no interest in politics or in the Republic's endless wars. He sought only the places where life itself had been broken and where it might be rebuilt in his image. For months, their ship drifted between forgotten systems. Ruined laboratories, cracked moons, derelict science stations swallowed by sand and time. Each location held echoes of a Sith empire long vanished. The air still hummed with experiments too dangerous to record. And Hego now, wordlessly accepting the title of Apprentice, watched, absorbed and learned. The lessons were unlike anything imagined in legend. Tenebrous showed him that the Force could be harvested, measured, manipulated. He called it applied transcendence. To the galaxy, it would have sounded blasphemous. But to Plagueis, as he was slowly being named, it made sense. For Tenebrous, the Force was not divine. It was biology, a measurable phenomenon that flowed through cells, binding reality at a microscopic level. To control it was not to believe in it. It was to master its structure. And so, their laboratories became cathedrals, their instruments, sacred tools. Plagueis spent hours dissecting test subjects brought in from across the systems, some sentient, others engineered for the sole purpose of death. He studied the rise and fall of midichlorian activity during suffering, healing, and death. He saw the light fade from eyes and recorded the chemical shifts in real time. There was no horror anymore, only data. Every scream was an equation, every heartbeat an answer. And Tenebrous watched him closely, not with affection, but calculation. "The Jedi call this cruelty," he said once, as he stood over a dying creature submerged in fluid. "But what they refuse to see is that life and death are only reactions, and the Force reacts to will. We do not kill for pleasure, we kill for understanding." Plagueis said nothing. He only took notes. He began building his own models. He simulated bloodlines, mapping the Force potential of species across thousands of generations. He predicted how two Force-sensitive beings might produce an heir of exponential power. Tenebrous approved. He believed his apprentice's logic might one day achieve what he never could. The Sith Lord's obsession was clear: immortality through replication. He wanted to clone consciousness itself to transfer the essence of a Sith mind into perfect genetic hosts, erasing decay, erasing death. And though he spoke of destiny, of breaking the limits of the Force, Plagueis could see the flaw. Tenebrous believed he was building eternity. But in truth, he was building dependency. His survival depended on creation, not comprehension. And beneath that precision, Plagueis began to see weakness. His master's brilliance was unmatched, but it was tethered to ego. Tenebrous saw himself as the end of the Sith cycle, the last iteration of the rule of two, the one who would replace destruction with continuity. But Plagueis had already learned something deeper. Continuity meant stagnation. Stagnation meant death. And death, he realized, was not the enemy. It was the teacher. He began to keep secrets. Silent experiments within Tenebrous's own research logs. He modified genetic codes, spliced Force-reactive tissue in ways his master never noticed. He learned how to control midichlorians, not to extend life, but to extinguish it. Quietly, instantly, without a trace, and though he never admitted it aloud, he had already decided that the day would come when Darth Tenebrous would become just another specimen. There was no sunrise in their part of the galaxy, only the cold pulse of machinery and the soft rhythm of a dying world beneath their feet. For years, Darth Tenebrous and his apprentice remained hidden within the hollow crust of Baldemnik, a world rich in cortosis veins and poor in life. Its isolation made it perfect. No censors, no politics, only silence. And in that silence, the Sith Lord continued his work. He spoke of immortality not as myth, but as mathematics. He believed that if the Force was energy, it could be contained. If it could be contained, it could be replicated. And if it could be replicated, then consciousness itself could be reborn endlessly, like an equation looping forever. It was elegant, flawless in design, and completely blind. Because in his search for eternity, Darth Tenebrous had forgotten what made the Force alive. He had stripped it down to a formula, reducing will and emotion to sequences, denying the very chaos that gave it meaning. But Plagueis did not correct him. He listened, he observed, and quietly, he began to see beyond the equation. Tenebrous experimented on cloned cells, transferring living midichlorians between bodies. Most died instantly. Some survived only to scream until their lungs collapsed. The Sith Lord noted each failure without emotion, convinced he was moments away from perfection. Plagueis assisted. He kept his tone calm, his movements precise, his face unreadable. He learned what he needed and discarded what he did not. Because where his master sought to dominate life, Plagueis began to understand something far more terrifying. Life could be persuaded. It did not need to be conquered. It needed to be convinced. Through will, through thought, through perfect control. The Force responded to intention, not force. And in this understanding, a new kind of Sith philosophy began to form within him. Quiet, patient, inevitable. When Tenebrous spoke of the rule of two, he described it as insurance. Two minds, one purpose, one to preserve the other. But to Plagueis, it was a flaw. Two was not balance. Two was vulnerability. If immortality could be achieved, then the rule of two would no longer be necessary. No apprentices, no masters. Only one eternal will guided by perfect understanding of life and death. He began experimenting alone in the lower chambers. Where Tenebrous focused on replication, Plagueis focused on influence. He learned to touch living cells through the Force, to accelerate healing, to slow decay, to coax midichlorians into obedience. He learned to feel their song, and when one organism died, he could sense the exact moment the Force withdrew the silence between life and nothingness. He began to wonder if he could call it back. Tenebrous mocked. The thought, the Force does not obey emotion, he said. It obeys precision. It obeys control. But Plagueis saw the irony. His master, for all his intellect, feared what he could not define. He feared the moment his own breath would stop, the instant his control would end. And that fear was spreading. It made him crueler, more erratic, more aware that his apprentice was no longer beneath him, but beside him. Every correction carried edge. Every word lingered with doubt. And though the Sith Lord spoke of destiny, he had begun to watch Plagueis the way prey watches its predator. Neither of them slept. Neither of them trusted the other. And deep beneath the crust of Baldemnik, surrounded by the echoes of failed immortality, Darth Plagueis began to prepare for his master's death, not out of anger but necessity. Because the Force, he realized, was already waiting for one of them to stop breathing. It happened in a cave, not in battle, not with blades, not with fire, but in a silent, airless tunnel, carved through layers of cortosis and forgotten time. They had come to Baldemnik's lower crust to study a rare mineral reaction, something Tenebrous believed could enhance Force sensitivity at the genetic level. Another theory, another obsession, another dead end. The narrow shaft collapsed. A vibration, a fault line, a crack through the stone. And just like that, the mighty Sith Lord was buried. Plagueis could have moved the rocks. He could have saved his master with seconds to spare. But he didn't. He stood at the edge of the collapse, watching, listening. He heard the breathing beneath the rubble shallow. Panicked, he felt the pulse of the Force, trembling. And he waited. Long enough for Tenebrous to understand what was happening. Long enough for him to know. When the silence came, it was like the end of a storm. Clean, quiet. Plagueis inhaled once and stepped forward. But he did not walk away. Not yet. He cleared the rocks, one by one, with the precision of a surgeon. Tenebrous's body was twisted, bloodless, but intact, and his mind was still alive. Barely. His eyes opened, clouded, dimming, and in his final breath he spoke, "You fool." There was no anger in it, only inevitability. Tenebrous had seen this future, predicted it, perhaps even desired it, but he hadn't understood the meaning of it. Plagueis knelt beside him. "I didn't strike you down," he said quietly. "You collapsed under the weight of your own failure." The Sith Lord exhaled, one final breath, and then he was gone. No explosion, no prophecy fulfilled, no legacy honored, just death. Plagueis sat with the body for hours. He didn't speak, he didn't mourn. He observed. The midichlorians were still active, still present in the decaying tissue, still responsive. And in that moment, he saw it. The boundary, that thin line between life and the void. Not a wall, not a mystery, but a threshold, one that could be studied, understood, crossed. He began taking samples, recording molecular data, charting the death of a Sith Lord like it was a research subject, because it was. Tenebrous had believed he was the architect of immortality, but he had become the foundation. The Force did not scream, it did not mourn, it accepted, and in that quiet acceptance, Plagueis felt something new. Not joy, not triumph, but clarity. He was alone now, the last Sith, and the first to see death not as an end, but as a variable. He did not bury the body, he did not burn it. He left it in the stone, perfectly preserved as a symbol of what he would never become. He returned to the surface in silence. The air was thin, the stars cold, but he felt no fear, no hesitation. Because in that moment, Darth Plagueis was born. Not from rage, not from revenge, but from reason. And the galaxy didn't even know it had changed. The cave had gone quiet, but the silence did not feel like victory. Plagueis stood alone, deep within Baal Demnik's crust, surrounded by the remnants of his former master. Dust settled in the air, rocks still shifted overhead, but Tenebrous was gone, truly gone. There was no final breath, no last scream, no ritual. Only a failure in geology and the absence of intervention. Plagueis had let it happen. He had made the decision without words, and now he stared at the body not as a murderer, but as a student. He crouched beside the twisted remains, feeling the weight of the Force still clinging to the corpse. It hadn't fully left yet. Tenebrous had been strong, arrogant, obsessive, but beneath all of it, he had been brilliant. And Plagueis couldn't ignore that. He examined the body slowly, not with reverence, but with precision. Each injury, each fracture, told a story of impact and compression, but none of it mattered. The truth had already happened. Tenebrous was no longer the master, and Plagueis was something new. Still, something kept him from walking away. He activated a scanner, pulling data from Tenebrous's decaying cells. Midichlorian activity was rapidly declining, but still detectable. He placed a neural tether on the base of the skull, recording residual cognitive traces, fragments of thought, sparks of memory. He wanted to know what Tenebrous had been thinking in those last moments. It wasn't sentiment, it was study. He believed that death itself could be measured, observed, even mapped. And this was his first test subject. The cave felt colder as the hours passed. He barely noticed. Time had become irrelevant. And yet, through the instruments, something surfaced. A signal, an anomaly. Not random, not static, but rhythmic. He adjusted the device. The pulse grew stronger. It was coming from the brainstem. Not memory, not residual nerve function. Consciousness, or the shadow of it. Tenebrous had left something behind. Not a message, not a farewell, but a footprint. Plagueis felt the back of his neck tighten. He stepped away, cautiously, not afraid, but unsure. The force stirred, low and deep, as if awakening to the truth that what lay before him was not just a corpse. He closed his eyes, reached out, felt the cold remnants of Tenebrous's mind. It was faint, fractured, but it was there, a lingering presence, staring back at him, not with hatred, but with expectation. Plagueis didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply lowered the scanner, shut off the light, and stood in the dark. The cave breathed around him, stone cracking softly, air thin and dry. And in that quiet, he understood something that would haunt him for years to come. Killing Tenebrous was not the end. It was the beginning of a question. Not, was it right? Not, was it necessary? But did it work? And if it did, what was watching him now? Plagueis stepped away from the body, his thoughts clear, but his mind uneasy. The force was no longer silent. It had begun to echo. Days passed. The body had long since cooled, but the air in the cave remained thick, heavy with the residue of something unseen. Plagueis did not leave immediately. He couldn't. He needed to understand what his master had left behind. He studied the corpse, the equipment, even the walls of the cavern, as if Tenebrous's final secret had seeped into the stone itself. And perhaps it had. The Bith had always planned for death. He had spoken of it like an experiment waiting for replication. He believed he could imprint his consciousness, record it, even project it within the force itself. To Plagueis, that had been arrogance, an illusion of control. But now, standing before what remained of him, he wasn't sure, because the data was impossible. Neural readings persisted long after organic activity had ended. Patterns of energy, repeated not randomly, but deliberately. A pulse, a thought, and in that repeating current, a word began to form. Not spoken, felt, failure. It struck him like a whisper against the back of his mind, not sound, but intrusion. He froze. The air seemed to twist. The light from his console flickered and dimmed. He thought he imagined it. He wanted to. But the word came again. Clearer, sharper, filled with contempt. Failure. Apprentice. His heart slowed. His breath steadied. And though he was alone, he turned his gaze toward the corpse as if it had spoken. The force around him had changed. It wasn't alive, but it wasn't still. It pulsed in strange intervals, shifting with each syllable that wasn't a sound. He tried to resist, to shut it out, but something inside the dead tissue, the lingering will of Darth Tenebrous, was still moving. And through that fragment of consciousness, a vision began to form. Plagueis saw himself older, stronger, standing in a room lit by city lights and ambition. He was speaking to another figure, a young man, human, calm but dangerous, eyes like polished glass. The two spoke as equals, and then, without warning, the apprentice turned. There was betrayal, a flash of light, a sound like wind leaving lungs, and then nothing. The vision ended as quickly as it began, but its meaning lingered. Tenebrous had left it behind, a prophecy not of fate, but of consequence. That Plagueis, for all his control, for all his intellect, for all his precision, would die by his own creation. Not in battle, not in rebellion, but by the very design of the system he believed he had mastered. Plagueis tried to dismiss it. He told himself it was the final illusion of a desperate mind, a ghost clinging to relevance. But doubt, once spoken, never leaves. He stared down at the withered features of his master, the faint blue shimmer still dancing across the skull. Even in death, Tenebrous had engineered the perfect cruelty. He had given his apprentice the one thing a Sith could never escape, the knowledge that all power ends. Plagueis knelt, closed his eyes, and reached again into the dark currents of the Force, searching for silence, for certainty. But the darkness didn't answer. It only listened, and somewhere, buried within it, a presence waited, watching, remembering, amused. Plagueis rose to his feet, cold resolve returning to his voice. "If prophecy exists," he whispered, "I will rewrite it." He turned away from the body at last, but the echoes of that word followed him out of the cave. Failure. It would never stop. Not for the rest of his life. There are moments when the Force does not behave. It doesn't roar. It doesn't warn. It lingers. Plagueis returned to orbit, leaving the cave and its secrets buried beneath layers of rock and mineral. But something came with him. He couldn't explain it, couldn't name it, but he felt it. A pressure behind his thoughts. Not a voice, not an emotion, just presence. It didn't speak unless he opened himself to the Force. But when he did, especially when meditating, or probing into the questions of life and death, the pattern returned. Slight, repeating, wrong. At first, he assumed it was residual trauma, guilt, though he'd never admit such a thing aloud. But guilt fades. This did not. The deeper he studied the midichlorians he had harvested from Tenebrous's corpse, the more erratic their behavior became. Not inert, not unstable, responsive, as if something within them remembered the shape of its master. He isolated a strand, suspended it in a sterile environment, and began basic stimulation. He recorded the reactions, and for a single moment, the organism responded with intent. A flicker of midichlorian density in the fluid, not instinctual, directed. And in that flicker, Plagueis felt something ancient crawl beneath his skin. It was not the Force. It was something trying to use the Force. He recoiled, pulled back from the tank, and for the first time in years, he hesitated. He had killed Tenebrous, buried him, extracted every trace of value. But he hadn't destroyed him, not completely. Somewhere in the swirl of biological fragments and scattered energy signatures, Tenebrous had imprinted a sliver of himself. A thought, a loop, a shard of ego that refused to die. It wasn't full consciousness, not yet, but it was growing, shaping itself. And it knew Plagueis was watching. He began to dream again, like in the vaults of Megiddo. Only now, the dreams were sharper, more specific. He saw flashes of Tenebrous not as he was in death, but younger, smiling, speaking in words that echoed through his skull long after waking. Sometimes, the voice whispered formulas, sometimes questions, but always beneath it, the same cold certainty. I was never your master. I was your mirror. Plagueis began to lose track of time. He checked his records compulsively, repeated tests, remeasured outcomes, but nothing could explain what he felt. Not possession, not memory, something older. Tenebrous hadn't just defied death, he had infected the one who killed him, not like a virus, like an idea, one that lived in the bones. In the silence between thoughts, Plagueis locked away the samples. destroyed the data, sealed the chamber in magnetic containment. But the feeling didn't leave. Because this wasn't about the remains. It was about him. Tenebrous had planted something in his apprentice that no scalpel could remove. Not a trap, a test, to see if Plagueis would break under the weight of doubt. To see if his successor would become obsessed, just as he had. To see if death could be taught. Plagueis meditated in isolation for 3 days. No movement, no speech, only silence. And at the end of that stillness, he made a decision. He would not fight the presence. He would not flee it. He would outlast it. Because if Tenebrous had left behind a mind, Plagueis would become the will that devoured it. Plagueis returned to Megiddo alone. The ship's corridors felt emptier than before, though they had never held warmth to begin with. He had won. He had claimed his freedom. He had surpassed his master. But he didn't feel complete. He felt split. Something was wrong. Not in the galaxy. In himself. He tried to resume his old rhythm, overseeing accounts, directing investments, manipulating planetary economies from the shadows. His influence grew, his reputation spread, but his clarity wavered. At night, he felt watched, not by spies or enemies, but by possibility, by the version of himself that Tenebrous had warned him about. A version that would be betrayed, that would fall, not in war, but in sleep. It was a wound, invisible, unbleeding, but real. The first scar of Plagueis was not the death he delivered. It was the truth he couldn't unsee. He could control cells. He could shape lives. He could bend the force around his will. But the future, the end, remained hidden. And Tenebrous had shown him just enough to know he would never stop searching. That was the trap. The one his master had set not with blades, but with ideas. Plagueis buried the last physical traces of Tenebrous deep beneath the archives of Damask holdings, encrypted, sealed, and hidden within unmarked storage. But memory is not something that can be locked away. He began to change, more careful, more isolated, more obsessed, not with power, not even with immortality, with proof. Proof that he could break the pattern, that the rule of two would end with him, that betrayal, death, and prophecy were errors he would correct. He studied ancient texts that even the Sith had deemed forbidden. He deciphered archaic holocrons lost since the fall of the Old Republic. He hunted forgotten force, cults that had touched the edge of death and survived. And every time he thought he had found the answer, it slipped. Because someone was always there, watching, waiting, smiling with no face. The voice had gone quiet, the dreams faded, but the presence remained, not loud, not aggressive, but constant, like a bruise beneath the skin of the Force. Plagueis learned to live with it, not as weakness, but as reminder that he was not yet what he needed to become. Not a Sith Lord, not a destroyer, not a savior, but a scientist without mercy. He adopted the name Plagueis fully now, shedding Hego Damask in the places that mattered. And in the silence of his private sanctum, he made a vow that one day he would not fear prophecy. He would write it, line by line, in the blood of stars and the breath of those who dared to follow. But deep beneath the vow, a shadow still lingered. Because in killing Tenebrous, he had proven he was worthy. But in surviving him, he had become something else, a legacy, a successor, and unknowingly, a prisoner. The first scar of Plagueis was never on his body. It was beneath his thoughts, a memory that refused to die. He returned to the galaxy not with an army, but with a signature, Hego Damask, Senior Chair of Damask Holdings, a name the Republic trusted, a name the banking clan obeyed. No one questioned his reappearance. He had been absent, yes, traveling, they said, Private retreats, long negotiations, estate realignments, but in truth, he had not been away. He had been becoming. Now, Darth Plagueis moved through galactic space draped in wealth, not as a warrior, not as a prophet, but as a presence so well-dressed, so flawlessly mannered, that even the Jedi never thought to look closer. He rebuilt his public identity with care, updated holdings, reactivated investments. He made appearances at diplomatic summits, signed treaties, hosted galas, and beneath all of it, he listened to politicians, to merchants, to whispers, because true power didn't live in thrones. It lived in hesitation, in influence, in debt. Through the intergalactic banking clan, Plagueis began to sculpt the economy itself, not quickly, not recklessly, but like a sculptor chiseling a monument only he could see. He offered low interest to struggling systems, only to increase the rates once they grew dependent. He funded opposing sides of border disputes, ensuring both came to him for aid. He backed senators whose loyalty could be bought, and sabotaged others through economic scandal and quiet ruin. No blood, no lightsabers, only silence. In the Senate, he became a name whispered between closed doors. In the upper echelons of the banking clan, he became untouchable. But this was only the surface, because while the galaxy watched Hego Damask rise as a financier, Darth Plagueis continued his true work in hidden laboratories across the Mid-Rim. Facilities with no names, researchers who did not know who they served, medical vessels that traveled under false transponder codes. He funneled resources into bioengineering projects, purchased rare Force-sensitive DNA from slavers and collectors, acquired ancient Sith scrolls through shadow brokers. And each time he gained access to something new, he returned to one question: could life itself be redesigned? He studied planetary ecosystems, not for science, but to learn how the Force shaped adaptation. He mapped the genetic variance between species with high midichlorian counts. He tracked Jedi bloodlines discreetly, methodically, and from time to time, he revisited Tenebrous data, not out of respect, but to remind himself of what failure had looked like. Plagueis didn't believe in fate, but he believed in patterns, and if the Sith were to survive beyond the rule of two, they would have to abandon the old patterns, not through violence, but through precision. He created shell corporations to fund anti-Jedi sentiment in backwater systems. He tested how far the Republic would bend before breaking, and every time the Jedi intervened, he watched, measured, predicted. They were slower now, detached, blind to the ground shifting beneath them. But still, he remained cautious, because beneath all his moves, there was still a voice that reminded him of failure. The memory of Tenebrous had faded, but it had not vanished. And so Plagueis wrapped himself in silence. He avoided unnecessary displays of power. He never revealed his Sith name outside private reflection. He never allowed ego to rise above control. He became the perfect mask. To the Republic, he was a stabilizing force. To the banking clan, a visionary. To the Sith, a whisper lost to time. But in truth, he was building something far more dangerous than any weapon. He was building trust, the kind of trust that makes governments surrender their future without realizing they've already been bought. And in that trust, Plagueis found the first edge of true immortality, not of flesh, but of influence. Because if the galaxy depended on him, then no one would ever try to destroy him. Not until it was far, far too late. Power had never been about the Force. Not really. Not for Plagueis. It was about systems. Who built them, who understood them, and who could collapse them without being seen. In the chambers of the intergalactic banking clan, his voice became law. He didn't raise it. He didn't threaten. He simply asked questions no one else dared to answer. And slowly, the galaxy answered back. He made himself indispensable. When entire sectors faced collapse, he offered credit extensions. When planetary leaders lost re-election, he had already backed their successors. When warlords rose in the Outer Rim, he made sure both sides owed him before they ever fired a shot. The Republic Senate didn't see it, not because they were blind, but because they were distracted. Corruption was no longer a disease, it was a service, and Hego Damask provided it better than anyone. He made sure that every crisis was followed by opportunity, and every opportunity led back to him. But money was only the outer shell. What he truly controlled was belief. He gave struggling systems hope, temporary relief, followed by permanent change. He allowed idealistic senators to rise just high enough to be discredited. He let noble causes burn out at the exact moment they began to threaten his long plan. Because in a galaxy built on credit and compromise, truth was the first casualty. And Plagueis understood that people didn't fear war. They feared uncertainty. So he gave them stability, a myth of control. And in return, they gave him everything. Behind closed doors, he began influencing the selection of supreme chancellors, not through manipulation, but through debt. He backed candidates who owed him favors. He removed rivals by crashing their planetary economies in ways no one could trace. And those who rose to power thanked him without knowing why they had succeeded. He wasn't just shaping policy, he was choosing who would write it. But through all of it, he never lost sight of his deeper work. In secret, his laboratories expanded. He began importing subjects from across the galaxy. Some were volunteers, promised healing. Some were prisoners, never missed. Some were Jedi initiates whose records had been quietly erased. He didn't kill them, not at first. He observed them, listened to their dreams, measured their connection to the Force in real time. And when they died, he documented the exact second the light left their cells, not as a monster, but as a man searching for something beyond death. Because the closer he moved to power, the more he feared what power could not stop. Time, decay, the quiet betrayal that all organisms face when their usefulness ends. He didn't want to rule forever. He wanted to outlast the galaxy's mistakes, to become the hand behind the curtain that would never need to be replaced. And so, he focused not on armies, but on bloodlines. He mapped families with strong Force sensitivity. He funded medical research on accelerated cloning. He tested theories on reproduction and spontaneous life. The Jedi would have called it sacrilege, but the Jedi weren't looking. They were diplomats now. Peacekeepers, not warriors. They debated philosophy while Plagueis rewrote biology. And in that silence, he made his final choice. To create a new legacy, not through tradition, not through training, but through design. He didn't need an apprentice yet. He needed a prototype. A being not born, but constructed. Not trained, but destined. Because if he could master life at its root, then everything that followed would belong to him. And the galaxy would never know until it was too late. The laboratories had no names, no windows, no records. Only sealed doors and silence. They were built beneath oceans, inside asteroids, within ancient ruins left behind by empires long forgotten. And in these places, Plagueis became what no Sith had ever dared to be. Not just a master, not just a manipulator, but a god of biology. He no longer viewed the Force as a weapon. It was a material now. A thread that wove itself into every cell, every breath, every heartbeat. And he believed it could be rewoven, one subject at a time. The first experiments were failures. Cells rejected the changes. Midichlorians collapsed under pressure. Life, for all its beauty, resisted manipulation. But Plagueis did not stop. He increased precision, abandoned broad-spectrum theories, moved from species-wide experiments to individual control. He kidnapped no one. He simply made them disappear. People who didn't matter. Convicts, runaways, names no one remembered. And sometimes, those the Jedi had lost. Children once strong in the Force, now fallen through the cracks. He found them, he kept them, and he studied what made them different. He wasn't cruel, but he was complete. He monitored breathing patterns in real time as midichlorian levels shifted. He watched blood react to emotional trauma. He timed death down to the millisecond, not because he wanted to kill, but because he wanted to know why death happened at all. He began experimenting on pregnant hosts, altering the conditions of conception, attempting to create life, not randomly, but intentionally. He tracked Force resonance in embryos. He studied how midichlorians formed before birth. He never succeeded, not fully, but he came close. Too close. One experiment, unrecorded, untraceable, produced a reaction he could not explain. A spike in midichlorian activity across multiple systems, as if something had awakened, something unexpected. He destroyed the records, shut down the station, eliminated the scientists. But the event haunted him, because for all his control, he could not explain it. And that meant he hadn't done it alone. Something in the Force had responded, not like an ally, not like a tool, like a rival. The experiments continued. New samples arrived, new failures mounted. But Plagueis pressed on, not because he was close to victory, but because he was too far in to stop. He told himself it was for the Sith, that he was building the end of the rule of two, that the future would not be inherited but engineered. But in the quiet of the labs he began to see the truth. This wasn't about the Sith, not anymore. This was about him, his legacy, his mind, his control. The Jedi meditated on harmony, but Plagueis dissected it. He mapped every connection between will and biology. He listened to the whispers of the Force not as a disciple, but as an interrogator. And every time he heard it resist, he leaned in closer. He wasn't looking for peace. He was looking for the threshold, the place where life begins to obey. Some test subjects went mad. Some became violent. Some simply stopped breathing without cause. He buried none of them. There were no names, only data. He recorded everything, down to the rhythm of their final thoughts. And as his notes grew, he saw patterns no one else could see. He didn't just understand the Force now, he understood its language, and he knew one day soon he would speak it better than anyone. But the Force was listening too, and though it did not speak, it began to shift. Not in fear, not in warning, in anticipation, as if it knew what he was building without permission, and was waiting to take it back. In the heart of the Republic, things felt calm. Trade was growing. Senate seats were stable. The Jedi Temple was full, but none of them saw the web tightening around them, because the spider wore a politician's smile, a banker's signature, a Sith's silence. Hego Damask was now a fixture on Coruscant, always present, always helpful, never central. He brokered peace talks between rival systems, secured funding for stalled relief efforts, and offered quiet support to politicians with fragile careers. But every favor came with a tether. Every deal was a thread leading back to him, and behind every smile, a calculation. He didn't need to control the Senate. He only needed to own its future. He studied their habits, not just in words but in fatigue, in disappointment, in the slow erosion of ideals. And when senators broke when they realized the machine could not be fixed, he was already there, ready to fund a new project, ready to solve a crisis, ready to place his hand on their future. They thanked him, They confided in him. They believed in him. Because he wasn't forcing the galaxy to change, he was letting it collapse on its own. And beneath that collapse, he laid foundation stones. Whispers, positions, names like Palpatine, a rising senator from Naboo, ambitious, charming, capable of much, but guided by someone unseen. Plagueis watched him from a distance, measured his voice, his cadence, his coldness. He saw potential, but not yet a threat. Not yet. For now, Plagueis's focus remained on the larger machine. He refined his experiments, refocused his gaze. He wasn't chasing life anymore. He was chasing timing. When to act, when to withdraw, when to let the Jedi believe they were still in control. Because control was no longer about presence, it was about invisibility. He kept no Sith temples, no armies, no symbols. He had no red blade, only red ink, and signatures that could change entire governments. The Jedi watched the galaxy shift, but their code kept them from seeing the truth. They meditated on balance, but Plagueis had already unbalanced everything. One contract at a time. He began preparing the banking clan for larger conflict. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. He knew that war was the only way to make systems truly dependent. And he needed the Republic to become a patient in need of life support. He would offer the cure, and with it the leash. He whispered into trade delegations, planted seeds in separatist circles, tested how far planetary governors would go before rejecting the Senate's authority. Every reaction was logged, every resistance studied, because he wasn't building chaos. He was building a trap, one that would snap shut not with violence, but with debt. By the time anyone noticed, it would be too late. He would own both sides of the coming war. And through that war, a new order would rise. But even as he approached his peak, the unease remained. His hands were steady, his plan flawless. But the Force had gone quiet. Too quiet. It didn't resist him. It didn't flow. It waited. And sometimes, when he reached into it, he felt something pull back. Not a warning. Not an enemy. A shape, formless, but watching. And he began to wonder if somewhere in the galaxy, something was being born outside of his control. Not through science. Not through design. But through the will of the Force itself. A counterweight to everything he had become. He didn't fear it. Not yet. But in the deepest chamber of his estate, beneath the vaults and behind the sealed doors, he began preparing for something he could not predict. A variable not yet visible. Because for all his brilliance, for all his precision, for all his quiet control, Darth Plagueis knew one truth better than any Jedi. The Force always responds. And somewhere, it already had. There is a silence that only exists in failure. Not defeat, not surrender, but the kind of failure that comes after control has been exhausted. Darth Plagueis sat in that silence more often than he cared to admit. His laboratories had grown, not just in size but in secrecy. Entire moons had become research hubs. Entire species erased from records after serving their purpose. He had moved beyond studying life. He was now trying to make it. Not clone it, not replicate it, create it, and not just any life. A being strong in the Force, not born from union, but from design. A child without parents, a vessel for power, unshaped by destiny. The Force itself in flesh. He had studied the old rituals, the Sith incantations, the Jedi theories on vergences and echoes. He'd even reviewed the Jedi prophecy of the Chosen One not to fulfill it, but to prove he could build something stronger before it arrived. He tracked midichlorian thresholds, spliced Force-rich bloodlines, induced conception through chemical and energetic manipulation. He monitored uterine activity in captured subjects. He stimulated cells to reproduce in vitro, but every result was wrong. Some had no heartbeat, others had too many. Some spoke in tongues before dissolving into seizures. Some lived for days, even weeks before their nervous systems collapsed in on themselves. And the worst of them simply stared, breathing, blinking, but empty. He ordered them terminated without hesitation. But he remembered every face, because each one reminded him that he did not yet understand what life truly was. He blamed the variables, the conditions, the host bodies. He blamed the force itself. As if it were holding something back, he became colder, more isolated, less patient with his assistants. He abandoned natural methods. He created artificial wombs, infused embryos with controlled midichlorian spikes, used Sith alchemy to bend tissue before it had shape, and still, failure. He began to dream again. Not visions of conquest, not prophecy, just silence, and a cradle that rocked itself without a child inside. His mind was unraveling, but he didn't know it, because the deeper he fell, the more he believed he was close. That one perfect test, one final variation would prove it was possible. He stopped sleeping, not out of urgency, out of fear, because when he closed his eyes, he felt watched. Not by enemies, not by ghosts, by the Force, not in anger, not in judgment, but in disappointment. Like a parent watching a child fail the same lesson again and again. Still, he pressed forward. He wasn't building for approval. He was building to overcome. He thought of Tenebrous, of the body buried in stone, of the whisper, failure, and he swore he would be the last Sith to ever hear that word. He began extracting material from Jedi artifacts, bones, cloaks, lightsaber crystals still humming with energy. He ground them down into compounds, used them in cellular reactions, but they rejected the process. As if the remnants of Jedi life refused to help him cheat death. He destroyed them all, one by one. And still, the void remained. The Force would not bend, not the way he needed it to. And so, he made a new decision. If life could not be created from raw energy, then perhaps it could be stolen. Not from tissue, not from donors, but from the Force itself. It was a line even ancient Sith had feared to cross. But Plagueis had never feared the dark. He only feared not understanding it. And as the lights dimmed in his private chamber, as the stars beyond his window burned quietly in their cages, he made a promise. The next experiment would not fail, because it would not be built from what already lived. It would be built from what should never have existed at all. There are sounds the galaxy will never hear, because they were buried, erased, swallowed by the hum of machines and the silence of space. Plagueis heard them all. His laboratories no longer felt like places of discovery. They felt like tombs, not for the dead but for the living who refused to die. He called them subjects, but even he knew that was a lie. They were people once, some Jedi, some slaves, some who simply wandered too close to his influence. He did not kill them outright. He kept them alive for as long as the Force allowed. Because it was not death he was studying anymore. It was suffering. He wanted to understand the exact point where pain and the Force became indistinguishable, where agony itself could open the door to immortality. He had theorized that in the instant between torment and death, midichlorians released a resonance, a final, desperate surge that echoed through the living Force. If he could harness that moment, trap it, measure it, he could learn how to sustain life indefinitely. So, he listened. He recorded every scream, every breath, every heartbeat that refused to end. He called it data, but it was madness disguised as science. He would stand over the operating table as bodies convulsed, watching life slip away and return again through his manipulation of cells. One subject, a captured Jedi Knight, survived 12 days without food or sleep. His body kept alive only through Plagueis's will. The man begged to die, but Plagueis wasn't listening. He was counting, timing, studying how long the Force would keep trying to heal what he refused to let die. When the Knight finally stopped breathing, Plagueis didn't grieve. He simply whispered, "Too soon," and began again. There were others. Politicians who crossed him, bankers who betrayed him, officers from the Republic fleet who thought they were indispensable. All disappeared into his silence. All became data points. He documented their midichlorian responses, the neural discharges during terror, the chemical balance of hope and despair. He wanted to quantify emotion. He wanted to know if love, fear, or hate had measurable value in the Force. He didn't find love. He didn't find peace. But he found something else. He found whispers. They began quietly, barely audible, a low frequency that pulsed beneath the hum of machinery. At first, he thought it was feedback, a malfunction in the monitors, an echo from the dying. But the whispers followed him. They weren't in the room. They were in the Force. He heard his name without sound, felt breath without air, and when he turned, he saw nothing. He thought it was exhaustion. He had been awake for days, maybe weeks, but then the lights flickered. The air shifted, and a word formed inside his mind. Stop. He froze. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't pity. It was command. The Force, the same current he had spent his life dissecting, was speaking. He reached out through meditation, expecting resistance. Instead, he felt a pulse, a rhythm, like a heartbeat that wasn't his. And in that pulse, he sensed it clearly. Not anger, not rejection. Revolt. The Force was fighting back. His subjects began dying before he touched them. Tanks ruptured, machines failed. Organic tissue disintegrated without explanation. And still, he tried to continue. Because obsession does not reason. He told himself he was not afraid. That this was proof he was getting close. But deep down, he knew something had noticed. Something beyond him, beyond Tenebrous, beyond every Sith that ever lived. It wasn't light. It wasn't dark. It was the balance itself bending under the weight of his ambition. He walked through his lab, past the dying, past the ruined machines, past the silence that no longer obeyed him. And for the first time, Darth Plagueis felt small. He had wanted to speak to the Force. But now, the Force was answering. At first, it was only small things, minor disturbances, moments that could be dismissed as coincidence. Data wouldn't record properly. Machines would malfunction the instant he began a new trial. Specimens would die just before results stabilized. And though Plagueis was a man of logic, he could not ignore the pattern. Something unseen, unmeasurable was interfering. He replaced every system, rebuilt every chamber, erased every trace of error. But the failures continued. The air around his experiments had changed. There was weight to it now, like a storm that never arrived. The Force itself had become hostile. He could feel it in meditation. Not the calm he once commanded, not the steady current of control, only resistance. It didn't push him away, it pressed back. Every time he reached out to manipulate life, the Force stiffened as if trying to remind him what he was tampering with. And when he ignored it, it punished him. Subjects began to suffer in ways even he didn't intend. Vital systems failed unpredictably. Midichlorians revolted within living tissue, turning creation into decay. He observed, but he could no longer predict. He'd lost the pattern. For the first time since Megiddo, Darth Plagueis felt uncertainty. He meditated longer, harder, trying to calm the turbulence within the Force. But the silence that had once obeyed him was gone. He began to see things in the dark, reflections in the glass tanks, shapes behind his own eyes when he closed them. He heard movement in rooms that were empty. Sometimes he thought he heard his own voice speaking back to him, words he hadn't said. Enough. Stop. Listen. He stopped listening, because to listen would be to admit that something greater was now in control. He refused that. He doubled his efforts. He burned through resources. He turned living beings into matter and matter into ash. If the Force wanted to resist, he would outlast it. He began using himself as a subject. He drew his own blood, infused it with altered midichlorians, let it flow back into his veins. He wanted to feel the process from within. At first, it worked. He could sense more, see more, perceive ripples of thought far beyond his reach. He could feel the pulse of life across systems. He could feel the slow dying of stars. He was becoming what he had always envisioned, the bridge between life and will. But it didn't last. His body began to shake when he meditated. His heart rate fluctuated. His mind fractured. He felt multiple sensations at once: fear, pride, sorrow, not his own, but belonging to those he had experimented on. Their pain lingered inside him, alive, present, and when he looked into his reflection, he no longer saw himself. He saw them. He shattered the mirror. He told himself it was fatigue, that his experiments were corrupting his perception. But deep down, he knew the truth. The Force was retaliating, not with rage, but with memory. Every life he had twisted, every will he had broken, every moment of suffering he had engineered was being returned to him. Not as punishment, as lesson. Because the Force does not forget. It bends, it flows, but it remembers. He began to sense it even when awake. The walls breathing, the hum of machinery aligning to his heartbeat, whispers forming out of electrical noise. At times, he would stop mid-sentence and look toward the empty air, as if something had entered the room. And though his words said nothing, his mind whispered one truth over and over. He had crossed a threshold that no being should ever cross. He had taken not just from life but from balance itself. And now, the balance was taking back. He stared at the glowing tanks around him, at the pale outlines of what was left of his subjects, and realized something he had never dared to think before. Perhaps death was not the enemy. Perhaps death was the only part of life the Force refused to share. The night he broke, the galaxy was calm. No wars, no riots, no tremors in the Force that anyone could sense. But in a hidden fortress on a forgotten world, the most brilliant mind in the galaxy finally came apart. Plagueis had locked himself away for days. No contact, no servants, no light. He sat surrounded by shattered glass tanks, the air thick with the smell of burnt circuits and the quiet drip of fluid from failed experiments. He had stopped recording his findings, stopped cleaning his instruments, stopped pretending he still understood what he was looking for. The Force no longer obeyed him. It mocked him. When he reached out, it receded. When he turned away, it whispered. It was no longer a current to command. It had become a presence that refused to leave. He told himself it was fatigue, that he needed rest, but rest never came. Because the moment his eyes closed, he saw them, the faces of every being he had broken. Their features blurred, their eyes hollow, their mouths whispering the same word in unison. Why? He would wake trembling, sometimes screaming, though no one was there to hear it. He tried meditation, but the Force pushed him out. He tried to focus on his breathing, but the rhythm no longer felt like his own. He was slipping, losing the boundaries between what was his and what he had stolen. And in that collapse, something new appeared. A shape, faint, shadowed, watching him from the edge of consciousness. It never moved, never spoke, but he could feel it. It wasn't Tenebrous. It wasn't the dead. It was the Force itself. And it was curious. He tried to ignore it, to resume his work. But the data no longer mattered. The experiments had become circular. No progress. No meaning. He began to question everything he had built. Every system. Every calculation. Every reason he had given himself for what he had done. He told himself it was for the Sith. For knowledge. For legacy. But in truth, it was for fear. Fear of ending. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Fear of dying without understanding why. That was the madness. Not the experiments. Not the cruelty. But the fear that all of it might still mean nothing. The Force was silent for days. And then, it wasn't. It began to whisper again. Not with words, but with understanding. He felt what it wanted him to see. That life and death were not opposites. They were one motion, a tide that no one could stop. Not even him. For the first time in decades, Plagueis wept. Not out of regret, out of clarity. He had tried to control something that was never meant to be controlled. He laughed quietly. The sound echoed through the empty halls. For a moment, he thought of ending it. To stop breathing. To stop resisting. To let the Force take him as it took everything else. But he didn't. Because beneath the exhaustion, beneath the madness, a spark remained. The same spark that had carried him from the ice towers of Megiddo, to the vaults of power, to the threshold of creation itself. He would not die a slave to fear. If the Force was balance, he would learn to tilt it again. He rose slowly. Shattered glass crunched under his feet. He looked upon the devastation, the tanks, the corpses, the wreckage of brilliance, and he smiled. Not with triumph, but with defiance. "I hear you," he whispered. "But I'm not finished." The air trembled. The Force pulsed once, as if in reply. And for the first time in years, it did not resist him. It simply watched. Because even in his madness, Darth Plagueis had done what no one else had ever achieved. He had made the Force itself pay attention. And somewhere, deep within that silence, it began to prepare its answer. It began without warning, not as a vision, not as a whisper, but as a silence that shouldn't have been there. Darth Plagueis had grown used to the rhythm of the Force. He could feel its tides subtle, flowing, predictable. He had learned its behaviors, its preferences, its resistance. He had even learned how to bend it. But one night, during a session of focused meditation, the current did not bend. It moved. Not toward him, not away, just around. He felt it like a change in gravity, like the moment before a structure collapses, when every molecule in the air holds its breath. It was not pain, not pressure, it was absence. The space where a ripple should have been. He opened his eyes slowly, tried to ground himself in logic. He checked his vitals, calibrated his instruments, monitored planetary activity. All systems were normal. The galaxy had not shifted, but the Force had. He felt it again the next day. Stronger, deeper, a disturbance not violent, but impossible. Like the future had blinked, and something had passed through it. He studied star charts, monitored Jedi movements, scanned regions of space for anomalies. Nothing. The Force wasn't broken. But it was no longer centered. It had realigned itself, not chaotically, but deliberately, as if it had made a decision without consulting him. He returned to his private sanctum and reached deeper. His mind, already tuned to the frequencies of birth and death, searched for patterns, for fluctuations in midichlorian resonance, for energy that didn't belong. And he found it. A spike, isolated, brief, near the edge of the mid-rim. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Because the spike was not attached to a planetary event, not tied to war, or famine, or death. It was tied to life. One life. An origin point with no echo. A heartbeat with no past. He studied it for days. Cross-referenced medical data, birth records, transport logs. None matched. The signal was clean. No parentage, no ancestry. The Force had not moved through this being. It had made it. And that for all his decades of research, all his studies of forced conception, controlled genetics, and induced life was impossible. He had tried to do this, had failed, again and again. And now, the Force had done it on its own. Without him, the realization shook him. Not because he was jealous, not because he had been outmatched, because it meant the Force had always been capable. It had simply chosen not to obey him. Until now. Now, it had acted, unprovoked, unaided, as if responding to a question he hadn't asked. He knew better than to believe in prophecy. But the weight of this event was undeniable. Somewhere, in the galaxy, a child had been born without a father, and the Force was converging around it, not gently, not slowly, but with purpose. He reached deeper, tried to see the child's face, tried to feel its signature. But the closer he came, the more the Force closed itself off. He had never felt that before. Not denial, not attack, just denial of access. As if the Force had locked a door and placed itself between him and whatever lay behind it. He sat back, cold realization forming like ice in his chest. For the first time in all his years as a Sith, as a scientist, as a master of the unseen, he felt like an outsider, like a system he could no longer predict. He tried to smile, tried to whisper that this too was part of his design. But the words didn't come, because deep inside, Darth Plagueis knew the rules had changed. And this time, he wasn't the one who had changed them. The anomaly became more than a pattern. It became a whisper in every current of the Force. What began as a flicker soon grew into something undeniable. Darth Plagueis stopped sleeping, stopped eating. He devoted every waking hour to finding the origin of the pulse. It wasn't fear at first, it was fascination. But fascination is only the first stage of dread. He scoured the archives of the banking clan, intercepted Jedi transmissions, even bribed mid-level Republic officers to forward him birth records from the Outer Rim. Nothing fit. No parentage matched the frequency. No lineage carried that purity. Until, at last, a rumor reached him, whispered among smugglers, traders, and refugee channels of a child born on a desert world to a mother who claimed there was no father. At first, he dismissed it. Too convenient, too poetic. But the coordinates matched, the timing matched, and the resonance, the pulse he had tracked through the Force was strongest when he turned his mind toward that world. Tatooine, a wasteland, a graveyard of suns and sand. Nothing lived there that the galaxy cared to remember, but something had been born, something the Force had made itself. He meditated again, this time not to control but to listen. And when he did, the Force no longer resisted. It let him feel just enough. A warmth, a radiance. Not the light of the Jedi, not the darkness of the Sith. Something deeper, older. It was creation without boundary, life without instruction. He felt the echo of the child's existence, the gentle hum of perfection that he had spent a lifetime trying to forge. And it terrified him. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was pure. It was what he had tried to be, what he had tried to manufacture. A being conceived by the will of the Force itself. No parents, no corruption, no flaw. For years, He had believed the Force was a tool, a current to be bent, a code to be rewritten. But this child proved otherwise. The Force did not serve him. It had been watching him, learning from him, waiting for him to push too far. And when he did, it answered not with punishment but with demonstration. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps his own experiments had caused the anomaly. Perhaps his manipulations of midichlorians had rippled through the Force and created something unintended. But the possibility was worse than denial. Because if that were true, then he had not created life. He had created the one thing that would end him. The thought haunted him. He began cross-referencing timelines, the moment of conception, the pulse through the Force. His last experiment, they aligned, almost perfectly. He stared at the data for hours, not breathing, not thinking. It was too precise to be coincidence, too exact to be random. The Force had responded to him, but not in servitude, in correction. He had tried to manipulate the balance to control life and death, to make the Force obey his will. And now, the Force had created a life that would undo his work. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but he felt it, the inevitability of it. He whispered to himself, "This is the price." And for the first time since he killed his master, he felt small. A god brought low by the consequence of his own design. He sent agents to Tatooine, quietly, disguised as traders, as surveyors, but each one returned with nothing, or didn't return at all. The Force was shielding the child. Even across stars, Plagueis could feel it, the veil around that tiny pulse of life. He could not see it, could not find it, could not touch it. He had built his life on the illusion of control. Now, control itself was mocking him. He sat in the dark, his hands trembling, the data flickering in the air before him. And somewhere, far away, a child's first cry echoed into the galaxy. A sound so small, so fragile, and yet strong enough to make a god feel fear. The moment he accepted that the child existed, Plagueis knew what he had to do. He had to find it, study it, understand it, control it. That was the only way to restore order, to prove that even this anomaly still obeyed the laws he had defined. But the Force had other plans. Every time he reached out, it drew away. Every time he focused on the child's presence, the current dissolved into static. He had spent his life forcing the galaxy to reveal its secrets. Now, the galaxy was hiding one from him. He expanded his network. Syndicates, smugglers, merchants, even political informants in the core. He searched the archives of Kamino, of Naboo, of Coruscant. He bribed the Jedi Watchers who oversaw the midichlorian registries. He analyzed every child born in the last solar year. Nothing matched. Every trail led to false leads, to orphans, to refugees, to deaths that shouldn't have happened. The Force was playing a game, not of chaos, of precision. It allowed him to glimpse the edges, but never the center. And he began to realize something terrifying. This wasn't simply birth, it was balance. For every act of creation he had forced, for every manipulation of life and death, the Force had been watching, recording, and now it had answered, not to destroy him, not even to stop him, but to correct him. The Force had made something to counterbalance his existence, a living equation to neutralize the virus he had become. He felt the truth pressing against his mind like a shadow with weight. Every meditation brought visions, not clear ones, but glimpses. A woman's face, a desert sun, a boy's heartbeat, a light so pure it could burn him blind. He tried to resist it, to wall it off. But resistance required separation, and the Force no longer separated him from what it wanted him to see. He dreamed of the child often, of eyes that glowed with light that was neither dark nor pure. He saw himself standing before the boy in a place outside of time, reaching out his hand to take what was rightfully his. And in every dream, the boy simply turned and walked away. No fear, no hatred, just silence. It was infuriating. It was humbling. He began to question his own place in the rule of two. If he had truly achieved mastery, why had the Force gone around him? Why had it made a weapon without consulting its supposed servant? He thought of Tenebrous again, his arrogance, his endless calculations, his death that had felt so inevitable. He thought of how the Force had refused to let Tenebrous's mind die, and now it had refused to let his failure die either. It had made the child from the ashes of his own defiance. He began to see himself not as the master, but as a test, a failed hypothesis the Force was now replacing. That realization cut deeper than any blade. He spent days in isolation, silent, still. He no longer tried to bend the Force. He just listened. And in that listening, he began to understand what he had missed all along. The Force was not a servant. It was not a master. It was a cycle. And cycles do not end. They renew. Every time power rises, balance responds. Every time darkness deepens, light answers. He had always known this, but he had never believed it until now. And belief was the one thing the Sith had taught him to destroy. He looked out at the stars from his fortress window, hands clasped, eyes sunken but unblinking. He whispered, almost in reverence, "The Force does not choose sides, it only chooses balance." The words frightened him, because for the first time, they felt like surrender. And Darth Plagueis had never known how to surrender. He had believed himself to be the architect of destiny, of death, of the next evolution of the Sith. He had pulled the strings behind senators, commanded the banks, and tampered with life itself. But now, with the birth of a child he could not touch, could not find, could not unmake, Plagueis realized he was the one being moved. He stood in silence at the edge of his meditation chamber. No lights, no holos. Only the hum of the Force refusing to answer him. He wasn't defeated, but he was cornered by something he could never predict, the will of the Force without permission. He retraced every step of his rise, every decision, every calculated betrayal, every life stolen in the name of knowledge. He had believed the Force to be a puzzle, something solvable, something that could be rewritten if you studied it long enough, bled into it deep enough. But the Force wasn't a problem. It was a presence. And now, it had made its move. He watched the Republic closely. Jedi activity increased. Council meetings grew more frequent. There were whispers of disturbance. Even the Jedi felt it now. But unlike him, they didn't fear it. They welcomed it. The prophecy was being whispered again. The chosen one. The one who would bring balance. A myth to most. But to Plagueis, a mirror. Not of his triumph, of his failure. He had studied prophecy, had dismissed it. But now it studied him. He dreamed of the boy. Clearer now. A child cloaked in light, walking through fire untouched. He tried to turn the vision away, tried to wake, but the Force held him still. In the dream, he reached for the boy, offered knowledge, power, immortality. But the boy looked through him, not with hate, with sorrow, and spoke just one word: no. Plagueis awoke in darkness, shaken, sweat cold across his skin. He had no wounds, but he felt marked. He doubled his efforts, resumed his genetic studies, prepared experiments. If the Force had made this child, perhaps he could make another, one to oppose it, to counter the balance before it took shape. But the work no longer answered him. Data unraveled, cells failed. He was working in reverse. And the child, wherever it was, continued to grow. Plagueis began to understand the truth he had always feared. He was not the master of this timeline. He was its catalyst. His experiments had not shaped the future. They had triggered it. The Force had responded, not as a punishment, but as correction. He remembered Tenebrous, the old Bith's obsession with legacy, with creating the perfect heir, and how that obsession had blinded him to the moment his apprentice ceased to be a student. Now, Plagueis understood. He was not the end of the rule of two. He was part of its design, its trap. He had believed he could escape it. But the rule wasn't made by the Sith. It was permitted by the Force. And now, that permission was being revoked. He stared at the stars, hands trembling again, not from fear but from the ache of realization. He had believed he was building the future. But all along he was only clearing space for something else, something the Force had already chosen. He was no longer the architect, no longer the engineer. He was the pawn, the one who believed he held the board, never seeing he was always a piece. The child would come, and when it did, everything he built would collapse. Not in a moment, but inevitably, ruthlessly. Balance always arrives. He whispered, voice thin and dry. Then let it come. But in the deepest corner of his mind, he heard the echo again, not a voice, but a knowing. It already had. It began not with power, but with curiosity. A political summit, a public affair. But even among nobles, senators, and advisors, he stood out. A teenage boy from Naboo, draped in culture, drenched in privilege, yet completely alone. His voice was soft, his words rehearsed, but his presence was cold. There was no fear in him, no desire to please, only control. Hego Damask watched him from across the chamber, surrounded by Trade Federation representatives and economic architects. The boy's father was speaking, but the boy was watching. Not the crowd, not the conversation, just Hego, a calm, expressionless stare, a stare that didn't blink, a stare that waited. When the meeting ended, the boy approached, not with reverence, not even curiosity, but with a single sentence. You don't belong here, do you? It wasn't a question, it was a test. And in that moment, Plagueis saw it. Not force potential, not strength, not destiny, but hunger. That same quiet sickness he had seen in his own eyes as a child. The need not to rule, but to escape the feeling of ever being ruled. His name was Palpatine, son of House Palpatine, future heir to a throne that meant nothing. His bloodline gave him power, but his silence, his stillness revealed something more. He spoke as if he had already lived through the conversation, as if he had measured each outcome, discarded the ones he didn't like, and allowed only the version that made him seem smaller than he really was. Most children wanted to be seen. This one wanted to be ignored until it was too late. Plagueis knew immediately he would take the boy, but not as a child soldier, not as a lab subject, as something more, an heir. He began carefully, whispers to the boy's father, conversations about sponsorship, financial mentorship, a noble cause to help young minds ascend in the Senate. But Palpatine didn't wait for permission. He arrived at Damask Holdings the next morning, alone. He didn't ask to be trained. He didn't even ask what the purpose was. He simply said, "Tell me what no one else will." Plagueis saw it clearly now. This was not a boy to be taught. This was a force waiting to be unleashed. He tested him slowly with riddles, with logic traps, with philosophical poisons, but nothing shook him. He did not wince at the idea of sacrifice. He did not recoil from the mention of genocide. He did not flinch when asked if peace was just a tool for delaying conquest. He simply asked, "And who decides what is worth preserving?" It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't cruelty, it was detachment. Palpatine had already let go of things most beings never could. Family, morality, guilt. All he wanted was the map, and Plagueis, without knowing it, had already begun drawing it for him. In their first month together, he taught the boy how to listen for what people weren't saying. By the second, he taught him how to move politicians without touching them. By the third, he wasn't teaching anymore. He was watching. Because Palpatine wasn't asking for tools, he was collecting leverage, not just over others but over him. Still, Plagueis didn't stop. He saw the coldness, he saw the distance, but he mistook it for obedience. Because every answer the boy gave was precise, every task flawless. And every time Plagueis pushed deeper into the Force, he felt the same thing in Sidious that he once felt in himself. A storm waiting to form, one that would obey until it didn't. He told himself it was loyalty, that he was being respected, that the rule of two was finally evolving. But somewhere deep in the currents of the Force, a whisper had already begun. The whisper of replacement. They never trained in temples. No lightsabers clashed in empty halls. No robes, no rituals, no hollow speeches about the dark side. Their lessons took place in offices, in council chambers, in the shadows between votes. Because the true path of the Sith was not about destruction, it was about infection. And Sidious, young, composed, always listening, became the perfect carrier. Plagueis showed him the foundation first, not of the Force but of government. The Senate was not a beacon, it was a dam, holding back chaos barely. And if you cracked its base, not with violence, but with whispers, the flood would come. Not in war, in policy. Palpatine absorbed it all. How to disguise ambition as public service. How to weaponize fear without ever raising your voice. How to fund an army without ever calling it one. Plagueis watched him grow. Not taller, deeper. His eyes no longer flickered with curiosity. They sharpened with precision. He didn't ask to learn Force lightning. He didn't ask to kill. He asked how to control a vote from 3 systems away. He asked how to mask a presence in the Force so even a Jedi Master would sense nothing at all. He wasn't a warrior. He was an invasion. Plagueis introduced him to allies, bankers, crime lords, industrialists, and Sidious memorized each one. Their fears, their addictions, their weaknesses, and one by one he began replacing them, not by murder, by offering them exactly what they wanted, a little faster, a little easier, a little darker, and by the time they realized the price, it was too late. He already owned them. Plagueis was proud, and proud of himself. He believed he had shaped the perfect tool, a mind not weighed down by doubt or legacy. A Sith apprentice who didn't fight the old ways but made them irrelevant. No lightsaber was needed when the Senate chamber itself was becoming his weapon. They moved quietly now. Plagueis controlled the economy. Sidious controlled the Republic's future. Together, they began crafting the long game. A slow corruption, a careful weakening, of Jedi credibility, of planetary alliances, of faith in democracy itself. And all the while, Plagueis continued to teach what no Sith had ever dared touch. The path to immortality, not through talismans or cloned bodies, or the dark arts of the ancients, but through the Force itself. By bending life at the cellular level, midichlorians, the microscopic link between all living things. And Sidious, with quiet fascination, listened to every experiment. He saw the failures, the collapsed bodies, the minds that broke in silence. And never once did he speak against it, because he didn't care about ethics, or suffering, or even life. He cared about how far the Force could bend before it snapped. How long a Sith could live before becoming something more. Plagueis believed they were partners now, that he had surpassed Tenebrous, that he had trained the one who would rule with him. But in quiet moments, when he turned away, he missed it. The way Sidious looked at him, not with hate, not with affection, with calculation, as if measuring the day he would no longer need his master. Not yet, but soon, because while Plagueis was shaping the future, Sidious was studying him, his habits, his rhythms, his trust. And slowly, like corrosion beneath marble, a new rule was forming, one that Sidious would follow with perfect devotion. Always watch your master, because eventually they stop watching you. Time passed, and with it, the illusion deepened. To the outside galaxy, they were distant acquaintances, a reclusive banker and a rising senator. But behind closed doors, they were architects. Plagueis whispered influence into the gears of the Trade Federation. Sidious pulled strings through Naboo's royal court, and slowly they began building the storm. A crisis in taxation, a fracture between core and rim, the soft hum of a war that hadn't begun, but would. Plagueis believed it was the fruition of all their planning, that the Tenebrous force itself was clearing a path. And in his mind, his apprentice stood beside him, ready to rule a new galaxy as equals. He shared everything now: blueprints for manipulation, secrets of genetic experimentation, even theories on transferring consciousness beyond death. He trusted Sidious with truths the Jedi would never dare speak aloud. And Sidious listened with perfect discipline. He asked the right questions. He showed patience. He waited, always waited for his master's approval. Plagueis saw loyalty. He mistook it for belief. But Sidious had already stopped learning. Because he didn't need more teachings. He needed opportunity. Every time Plagueis unlocked a new layer of the Force, Sidious measured its limits. Not to surpass them, to steal them. He walked through the Senate like a shadow, invisible to the Jedi, invisible to the Sith. He orchestrated arguments between chancellors, sabotaged treaties with a glance. While Plagueis toiled away in his lab, searching for the key to immortality, Sidious was discovering something more powerful: the art of invisibility. He had no army, no title, no weapon, yet entire sectors moved at his suggestion. And still, he returned to his master each night, with reports, with updates, with a bow of the head. He was careful to hide the cracks, never challenged a command, never delayed a task. He smiled, he obeyed, he waited. But deep inside, he was no longer the student. He was the executioner. Plagueis sensed nothing, because the dark side had a flaw. It rewarded ambition. It nurtured deception, but it also clouded trust, replacing suspicion with pride. And Plagueis was proud. So proud he never saw the silence in Sidious's eyes, how they no longer reflected curiosity, only calculation. He believed they were nearing the end, that immortality was within reach. He began drafting a new doctrine, a new rule, where master and apprentice would reign as two immortals, forever guiding the galaxy's evolution. He imagined himself as the mind, and Sidious, the blade. But Sidious was already thinking in different terms. He wasn't imagining an empire of two. He was imagining a funeral, not with fire, not with tears, but with silence. Because that's how Plagueis would die, not by betrayal, by ignorance, by never realizing the mask had already slipped, that the apprentice he thought he controlled was already beyond him, not stronger in the Force, not wiser in knowledge, just patient enough to wait for the night when the galaxy changed hands in the space between two breaths. And still, Plagueis called him my boy, my future, my legacy. He didn't hear the edge in Sidious's voice. Or if he did, he mistook it for passion. Because when a Sith Lord lives long enough, They forget the first lesson, the one they once taught with blood and silence, that the only true power is the one you never share. There was a time when Plagueis could read Palpatine's thoughts before they were spoken. He could feel the shift in his mood just by the rhythm of his breath. But that time was gone, and the Sith Lord did not know it. He believed he was still the eye of the storm, that everything Sidious became senator, manipulator, shadow was an extension of his own will. But the truth had rotted beneath him. Sidious no longer reached through the Force with obedience. He reached with masks, with barriers, with silence. And that silence, that dead stillness behind his apprentice's eyes, became something Plagueis could not penetrate. He dismissed it at first, as maturity, as evolution, as control. But deep in his mind, in the space between meditations, there was a whisper, a flicker of doubt. Not about the galaxy, not about their plan, about him, about the boy he thought he owned. There were moments, now, where Sidious would disappear, not physically, but in the Force, as if his presence were turning to fog, evaporating the closer you tried to reach it. It wasn't suppression, it was withdrawal. And when Plagueis tried to follow to sense what Sidious was doing in those quiet hours, he felt nothing. No treachery, no emotion, just distance. As if the Force itself was shielding the apprentice from the master. And still, Plagueis said nothing, because to speak it aloud would be to admit he no longer understood what he had created. He once believed the rule of two was about evolution, that each master would train an apprentice stronger, smarter, more ruthless, until the perfect Sith emerged. But perfection, he was beginning to see, came with blindness. For all his experiments, for all his mastery over life, Plagueis had missed the simplest truth, that ambition does not stop at instruction. It watches, it waits, it learns how to lie, and Sidious was lying now. Every smile, every report, every bow of the head. Plagueis once thought he was shaping a ruler, but Sidious was shaping his end. The final meetings between them were quiet, too quiet. Plagueis would speak of the coming war, of the shifting votes, of the careful placement of pawns across the galaxy. And Sidious would nod, always calm, always agreeable. But his words no longer carried curiosity, no longer carried awe, only completion. As if he wasn't hearing a plan, he was hearing a eulogy. And still, Plagueis could not bring himself to strike first, because the thought that his own apprentice could be planning betrayal after all they had built felt like failure. And failure was something he had erased from every cell of his being, until that final night, when they sat together in the upper spire of a tower overlooking Coruscant. The city lights blinked like stars below. Sidious brought the wine. Plagueis drank deeply, and spoke of their future, of cloning programs, of soul transference, of eternal rule. He did not see the glass, did not feel the poison, because his mind was wrapped in prophecy. And when his body began to fail, when his throat closed and his vision dimmed, he looked to Sidious for help. But the boy did not move. He only watched, with the same cold patience he had shown as a child. And in that final moment, as Plagueis struggled in vain to summon the Force, he realized with perfect clarity that the rule of two had always ended this way, and that the power he thought he commanded had already moved on, to a mind he could no longer read, to a master he had unknowingly trained, and to a darkness that now stood alone. They stood above the galaxy, not as master and apprentice, but as equals. Or so Plagueis believed. He had rewritten the rule of two in his mind, bent it to suit a new age. No more violent ends, no more treachery beneath the surface, not between them. He had raised Sidious from nothing, taught him everything. And in return, Sidious had become the perfect vessel. The Sith had always destroyed themselves, but now they would endure. Two shadows, one purpose. Plagueis called it evolution, a breaking of the chain. And in his arrogance, he believed he had finally solved the rule of two. But the rule was not a law to be solved. It was a consequence, a curse passed down from the first betrayal, and one that did not forget. Still, the illusion held. They shared everything: resources, strategies, long-term visions. They moved as one. Sidious in the light, Plagueis in the dark. The people saw a charming senator from Naboo, calm, eloquent, rising fast. They never saw the Muan behind him, never saw the one who spoke through silence, who pulled the strings of banks, guilds, and treaties. Together, they were more powerful than any Sith in centuries. And yet, in the quiet moments, in the hours when Sidious did not speak, Plagueis would glance at him and wonder. There was something unreachable behind those eyes, something waiting. But he told himself it was caution. He told himself Sidious was patient like him, because to admit anything else would mean the great experiment had failed. And Plagueis could not allow failure. Not now. Not when they stood on the edge of the greatest Sith victory in 1,000 years. He spoke often of the future, of eternal life, of cloned vessels and midi-chlorian manipulation, of dark side ascension beyond decay. And Sidious listened, always listened, never interrupted. And when he spoke with awe, with devotion. But beneath that voice was a rhythm Plagueis no longer recognized, a rhythm that did not follow his teachings, but danced beside them, shadowed them. And yet, the master did not ask, because he feared the answer. They sat in war councils, watched trade disputes fracture, fed arms to both sides of brewing conflicts. Everything was going according to plan. The Jedi were distracted. The Republic was bloated and blind. The rule of two, Plagueis believed, was at last becoming something greater. Not death and inheritance, but alliance. Not destruction, but destiny. Two Sith, one throne. He believed it. With every word he spoke, with every order he gave. But the Force remained silent. There were no visions, no warnings, no voices from beyond, only silence. And he took that silence as confirmation. The Force was not warning him, because there was nothing to fear. That was his final mistake. He thought they stood side by side. But Sidious had already begun to step forward, not beside him, but past him. The Senate chamber glowed gold under the artificial sky. Its walls, built to impress, echoed with speeches that meant nothing. Behind every vote, behind every war fund, behind every delay, they were there. Plagueis and Sidious, master and apprentice, or so it seemed. It began quietly. A minor trade conflict, a rising debt crisis, a new candidate funded by unseen hands. Plagueis watched it unfold from shadowed balconies, hidden behind glass, while Sidious stood beneath the lights. They were architects of confusion, using wealth, fear, and favors to twist the Republic into something brittle. Corruption had always lived in the Senate, but now it was being nurtured. The Jedi did not see it. Even those who sensed danger could not name it, because the face of the threat smiled too well. Palpatine, Senator of Naboo, was nothing if not polite. He spoke of unity, of justice, of common ground, and every word was a lie. Plagueis knew the process. He had done it before. Installations of Plagueis, puppet chancellors, bailouts tied to loyalty, wars that emptied treasuries and filled coffers. But Sidious moved with a precision Plagueis had not taught, a cruelty that felt rehearsed. Every ally was expendable. Every enemy was used before they were destroyed. and every step brought more power to their feet. The banks were his now. Hego Damask, still a public figure, still respected, had become the silent partner of half the galaxy's economy. Entire star systems were in debt to him. Entire militaries secretly funded by his hand. He could crash a government with a whisper, buy a rebellion with a nod, and still, he was not satisfied. Because control was not the goal. Not really. It was only the foundation. What they were building was darker and deeper. A system where the Jedi would become commanders, where senators would become slaves to crisis, and where fear would choose the future. And through it all, Plagueis saw victory. He believed the end was near, that soon they would reveal themselves, not as destroyers, but as saviors. When the chaos reached its peak, they would step forward, offer order, offer strength, and the galaxy would kneel gratefully. But something changed in Sidious. He spoke less, planned more. His network expanded without consultation. Whispers of new contacts. A dark warrior trained in secret. A new Sith name never spoken aloud. Plagueis asked questions. Not many. He did not want to seem weak. And Sidious always had answers. Elegant, calm, complete. Too complete. There was no hesitation in him anymore. And yet, Plagueis still believed. He believed in the future he had written. He believed Sidious was simply evolving into the role. The galaxy was unraveling perfectly, and the Jedi were reacting like politicians, slow, cautious, unsure. They saw the suffering. They saw the growing fear. But they did not see the hand behind it. Because Plagueis wore no armor, no robe, no lightsaber. He wore numbers. He wore currency. He wore laws twisted until they bled. And Sidious wore a smile. That was all they needed. The galaxy was falling, and the Sith were the wind pulling it down. The war had not begun. But its pieces had already been moved. Quietly, precisely, without resistance. On Camino, cloning facilities whispered back to life. Not by accident, not by chance, by design. A long-dead Jedi named Sidious. A mysterious order. Credits wired through invisible accounts. Plagueis watched it unfold and understood one thing. Sidious had already begun the war without him. But the Master did not feel betrayed. He felt proud. The boy from Naboo was now a blade sharp, hidden, unstoppable. And every cut he made drew the Jedi closer to ruin. Still, Plagueis believed he was the mind behind it all. That Sidious was simply executing his vision. The war would serve them both. A galactic conflict large enough to stretch the Jedi thin, deep enough to break the Senate, bloody enough to make peace feel like surrender. It was perfect. And yet, Plagueis began to notice the change. Sidious no longer waited for instruction. He made moves without asking. He kept secrets. And behind his eyes, there was no longer respect, only calculation. Even so, the plan moved forward. Separatist movements began to rise, funded in part by the same banks the Republic relied on. Fear grew. Trade routes closed. Assassinations increased. And from within the halls of the Jedi Temple, something began to twist. The Jedi were no longer guardians. They were becoming soldiers. And it happened so slowly. They did not notice until it was too late. Plagueis felt the tide rising. He could almost see the Jedi falling. Not in a great battle, not in fire, but in confusion, in disillusion. The Sith would not defeat the Jedi. The Jedi would lose themselves. And yet, Plagueis did not feel triumphant, because in the shadows, he began to hear whispers again. The same voices he had ignored in his experiments. The same tremors in the Force that had haunted him since the birth of the Chosen One. But now, they grew louder. They did not speak with language. They spoke in warnings. Images, futures, screams behind glass. And in each one he saw himself alone, betrayed, dying. He dismissed them at first, called them echoes of fear. But each night they returned. And he began to wonder, was Sidious shaping the future, or hiding it? There were signs. Palpatine's rise was too smooth, his enemies too conveniently removed. Even those who questioned him disappeared without mention. Plagueis asked nothing. He watched, measured, waited, and finally, he saw it. A moment in the Senate chambers, a glance, a gesture, a signal not meant for him. Sidious had another network, one he did not control. And that was when Plagueis felt it for the first time in decades. Not anger, not pride, but fear. The war was coming. The Jedi were distracted. The galaxy would beg for order. And at the center of it all, not two Sith, only one. He tried to push the thought away, tried to believe that Sidious still needed him, that together they would step into the light as rulers of a new Sith empire. But something inside him had shifted. A whisper, a warning, a voice not from the Force but from his own mind. You taught him everything. Now he knows how to end you. The night was silent. Coruscant's towers shimmered like veins of light running through the dark. It was the eve of their triumph. The galaxy, though it didn't know it yet, already belonged to them. Plagueis stood by the window of his penthouse suite, a monument of wealth and secrecy. He had done it. The Sith had won. No saber strikes, no temples burned, no grand declarations, just silence. A victory written in credits, votes, and fear. He watched the speeders drift through the city's mist, their trails glowing faintly like the neurons of some vast, dreaming mind. And he smiled. Sidious was on Naboo that evening, securing the last of the political alignments, the final step before their reveal. Plagueis was certain of it. Now they would rule together. The rule of two would end, not in betrayal, but in harmony. He had cheated the curse. He had done the impossible. He poured a glass of wine, the same vintage Sidious had gifted him weeks earlier. The same smile had accompanied it, the same polite words. For when the galaxy finally belongs to us. He drank deeply and waited for his apprentice to arrive. Sidious entered hours later. The mask of the senator was gone. He moved with quiet grace, his cloak whispering over the marble floor. "My master," he said softly, bowing low. "Everything is ready." Plagueis nodded, weary but satisfied. "You have done well, my boy. Tomorrow, we will begin the new age." Sidious smiled. Indeed, a new age. They sat together, master and apprentice, as they always had, discussing destiny, immortality, and control. But beneath the words, the air felt heavy, strange, unfamiliar. Plagueis blinked, his vision softening at the edges. His breath slowed. He thought it was exhaustion. Too many hours awake, too many plans, too many dreams. Then his heart began to fail. He tried to speak. The words came out as a whisper. "Sidious." The apprentice did not answer. He only watched. Calm, patient. As the poison spread through Plagueis's veins, the master tried to summon the Force to heal himself, to resist, to command the midichlorians he had mastered. But they did not answer. They were silent. And in that silence, he understood. He had never commanded them, only borrowed them. And now, they had returned to the will of the Force. He fell to his knees, gasping, trembling, his mind racing through decades of triumph and terror. He tried to speak, to warn him, to beg him. But Sidious knelt beside him, his voice cold, almost tender. "You taught me everything, my master. How to deceive, how to rule, how to never share power." He leaned closer. "And for that, I thank you." Plagueis's vision blurred. He tried to reach out to the Force, to his apprentice, to anything. But the dark side did not save him. It only watched. His fingers brushed against Sidious's robe. The last thing he felt was the warmth of his apprentice's hand on his shoulder. A comfort, a mockery. Then darkness took him, and as his final breath escaped, Sidious whispered, "Now I am the master." When the sun rose over Coruscant, the galaxy continued as if nothing had happened. The Senate convened, the Jedi meditated, the people dreamed, and high above them all, the new Dark Lord of the Sith stood at his window. He looked down at the endless city his master had once admired. It no longer shimmered, it burned. He smiled faintly, and whispered to the ghost of his teacher, "You were wrong. The rule of two was never meant to be broken. It was meant to be fulfilled." The Sith lineage continued. The Republic rotted, and somewhere in the Force, the whisper of Plagueis faded not in defeat but in realization. For even in death, he understood the truth he had ignored all his life. No matter how powerful a Sith becomes, they never see the blade until it's already in their heart. It was not the end. It was the beginning. Or so he believed. Darth Plagueis stood beneath the soft glow of Mygeetan moonlight, eyes closed, arms behind his back, listening not to sound, but to silence. The kind of silence that only came when every piece of the plan had settled into place, when no one questioned, when the future no longer resisted. The Clone Wars were days away, the Jedi were uncertain, and the Senate was already bending to fear. He had done it, not through armies, not through fire, but through patience, through decades of shadow. He watched from the highest tower of his fortress, a structure carved into ice and ore, hidden deep in the banks of Mygeeto's wealth, and beneath his feet the galaxy bent. He felt it in the currents of the Force. A shift, a surrender. For a brief moment, Darth Plagueis allowed himself to believe he had become what the ancient Sith had only dreamed of, a master not just of the dark side, but of life itself. In his labs, the work was complete. He had manipulated midi-chlorians, bent them to his will, prolonged his own vitality beyond what the body should endure. He had not simply slowed death, he had rewritten it, or so he told himself. Sidious had departed earlier that evening. There had been no tension, no suspicion, only the usual reverence. The quiet nod of a student still learning. Still serving, Plagueis had raised a glass in farewell. They had toasted in the marble halls of the estate, with the air of rulers, not conspirators. And as Sidious vanished into the night, Plagueis had believed the galaxy is mine now. He turned back to his chamber, the sound of his own breath steady, his body strong, his mind sharper than ever. He thought of the old Sith Lords Bane, Revan, Nihilus, and Dedu and pitied them. They had fought too loudly, died too early, lived without precision. But he would outlive even Sidious. He would rule from behind names and faces. He would never die. The dark had taught him everything. How to wait, how to listen, how to endure. And now, at the end of the waiting, he stood victorious. He entered his private quarters. Soft lights, polished stone, a decanter of vintage Alderaanian wine left unopened. He poured a glass, not to celebrate, but to remember. He had been born Hego Damask, a Muan child bred for finance, trained for logic, shaped by cruelty. But it was the Sith who had freed him, not with compassion, but with purpose. And in return, he had reshaped the Sith. He had made the rule of two into something deeper, an evolution through manipulation, not destruction. Sidious would not kill him. Not yet, not ever. They would rule together, break the rule, rewrite it, ascend beyond it. He believed all of this, until he felt the faintest shiver in the force. Not pain, not fear, just a whisper. A flicker, a breath held too long, and then it was gone. Plagueis smiled to himself. The force was adjusting, perhaps resisting his final steps toward immortality. It didn't matter. He sipped the wine, closed his eyes, let the night take him into peace. He did not know. The wine had already begun to still his blood. Sidious returned to Coruscant beneath the same night that covered his master. 1,000 lights reflected against his cloak as he stepped from his shuttle, each one a window into a future no one else could see. The Republic was his now. The Senate danced to his rhythm. The Jedi, so certain of their wisdom, were blind to the darkness growing beneath their feet. And in the quiet corridors of power, he smiled. Darth Plagueis believed the galaxy was ready for them both. But Sidious no longer believed in them. There was no rule of two. There was no partnership. There was only the rule of one. And it had already begun. He moved through his office slowly, hands behind his back, studying the holographic projections of star systems and trade routes. Everything was falling into place, exactly as he had planned the Naboo blockade. The Senate manipulations, the whispers of a phantom war. Every piece of the puzzle his master believed he controlled had already been shifted. By him, he remembered the first lesson Plagueis had taught him. Control life, and you control the Force. But what his master never realized was that to truly control life, you had to learn how to end it. Sidious poured a glass of the same Alderaanian vintage. He did not drink it. He merely observed the reflection of his eyes in its surface. They were no longer the soft amber of a senator. They burned faintly now, like twin suns eclipsed by shadow. He thought of Plagueis, the great manipulator, the visionary, the fool. For years, Sidious had listened to his lectures on immortality, on the science of life and death. He had pretended to share the dream. He had even played the role of apprentice, eager for the secret. But Sidious had no desire to live forever. He wanted to own forever. To outlast the galaxy not by life, but by legacy. That night, he had already made his decision. The laboratories on Sojourn would be sealed, the genetic archives erased, the formula for eternal life buried with its creator. Because the truth was cruel and simple. The Sith did not need immortality. They needed continuity. A cycle of power that would never end, so long as ambition remained. And Sidious was its perfection. He contacted his master through encrypted channels. Plagueis's voice came through faintly, calm as ever. "Everything proceeds as I have foreseen," the Mune said. "The time for revelation draws near. Tomorrow, the Republic bends." Sidious smiled faintly. "Yes, my master. Tomorrow, the Republic will belong to us." He ended the transmission. The silence that followed was heavy, not with guilt, but with inevitability. He had already prepared everything. The wine was ready. The atmosphere controls in Plagueis's chambers had been modified. Even the servants would be absent. Nothing left to interfere. Plagueis believed himself untouchable, a god among Sith. But gods still needed to breathe, and they still trusted the wrong people to pour their wine. Sidious walked to the window, watching the Coruscant skyline. He could almost feel it, the tremor in the Force that always came just before death. He whispered softly to no one, to the master who had given him everything except restraint. "You taught me control, but you never learned to let go." He turned away from the window. The night was nearly over, and somewhere far away, the illusion of eternity was already dying in its sleep. The chamber was warm, a rare comfort in the frozen heights of Megiddo. Soft light reflected off walls of silver stone, and the hum of distant machinery pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Plagueis sat alone. The air smelled faintly of wine and ozone. His mind drifted between thoughts of victory and legacy. He had done it. He was certain of it now. The Republic was collapsing. The Jedi were bound to politics, and the Sith, his Sith, stood on the edge of destiny. He smiled, faintly. For the first time in his long life, he felt peace. He had trained his successor well. Sidious was ruthless, cunning, and cold. He had become everything the Sith needed him to be. And soon, Plagueis believed, they would rule side by side, eternal masters of a reborn empire. He heard the soft chime of the entrance doors, the hiss of the air seal. Sidious had returned. "Master," came the familiar voice, calm, precise, without a hint of emotion. Plagueis turned. "Welcome back, my boy. How went the Senate's puppetry tonight?" Sidious stepped into the light. He was smiling, as always. "Exhausting, but effective. Our allies are secure. The final vote will go as planned." Plagueis gestured to the table. "Then drink with me." Sidious obeyed. 2 glasses were poured, deep crimson, warm, fragrant. The Muon raised his glass, his long fingers trembling only slightly. "To victory," he said softly. Sidious mirrored the gesture. "To the future." They drank. The sound was small, but in the silence that followed, it seemed to echo through the whole fortress. Plagueis leaned back, content. He began to speak of their next steps, the weaponization of the clones, the manipulation of trade routes, the dismantling of the Republic's final resistance. Sidious listened, always the good student, always silent when the master spoke. But tonight, his silence was different. It was heavier, measured. Plagueis didn't notice. He was speaking faster now, his excitement betraying the years of restraint that had defined his life. "The Jedi will never see it coming," he said, almost laughing. "We will end them with their own code. They will fight our war for us, and when it's over there will be nothing left to save." Sidious nodded slowly, eyes never leaving his master's. "Yes, my lord. Nothing left at all." Plagueis smiled, finishing his glass. "You have done well, Sidious. You've grown into the very image of power I envisioned. Together we will." He stopped mid-sentence. A faint tremor crossed his voice. A flicker of confusion clouded his eyes. He looked down at the glass in his hand. His fingers twitched. The room seemed to tilt ever so slightly. "What?" he whispered. "What have you?" Sidious stood slowly, the chair sliding back with a whisper against the floor. He said nothing. Plagueis blinked, his body no longer obeying him. His lungs fought for air. The Force, his oldest ally, did not respond. He reached out through it anyway, desperate, commanding, "Obey me!" But the Force did not move. It only watched. Sidious took a step closer. The light caught his face. For the first time in years, Plagueis saw no smile, only truth. The truth that had been waiting in every glance, every bow, every "yes, my master." The truth that had always been there. The Apprentice was finished waiting. Plagueis tried to rise, but his knees failed. The chair struck the floor with a dull echo. Sidious looked down at him, expression unreadable. "You taught me to seize power without mercy," he said quietly. "You were right." He set his glass down. The sound of crystal meeting marble was the only sound left in the room. Plagueis tried to speak, but only a gasp escaped his lips, and Sidious, without a trace of anger or joy, turned away. The lesson was complete. The sky above Coruscant did not change. No thunder marked the death of a Sith Lord. No tremor rippled through the Force loud enough to wake the Jedi from their dreams. Darth Plagueis died in silence, not in battle, not in rage, but in peace. The kind of peace that deceives. The kind that numbs before it kills. He had trusted too much. Not in the Force, not in prophecy, but in himself. All his life, he believed he could see further than any Sith who came before him. He saw the galaxy not as it was, but as it could be bent and broken beneath his will, reshaped in secret. He learned to twist life itself, to stretch the boundaries of creation, to touch immortality, but he never learned the most human lesson of all: to fear the ones closest to you. As the poison silenced his breath, he tried to reach out, not with his hands, they were already cold, but with his mind. The Force was still with him, but not in the way he expected. It did not scream in anger. It did not recoil from his death. It simply watched. It observed, almost amused. Sidious never raised a weapon, never lit his saber. He didn't need to. He whispered his final words, not to honor his master, but to bury him. The wine glass trembled in Plagueis's hand, then fell. His body twitched once, then stilled. There was no grand ceremony, no duel, no drama, just a slow exhale that never returned. And across the city, in chambers built for emperors, a new shadow stretched its fingers across the Republic. Darth Sidious walked away from the corpse without looking back. In his eyes, there was no grief, no triumph, only calculation. The plan was still unfolding. The Clone Wars would erupt soon. The Jedi would be weakened, divided, and the Chosen One, the anomaly in the Force Plagueis once feared, would soon kneel. Everything was falling into place, but one thing never left that room. One truth, one secret, that no Sith ever escaped. The apprentice always becomes the master, and the master always dies thinking he has more time. In the deepest vaults of Plagueis's fortress, experiments remained unfinished, data corrupted, lives extinguished. No one would find them. No one would know the lengths he went to for power. The lives he sacrificed, the voices he silenced. And yet, his legacy lived on, not in the way he hoped. He did not achieve eternal life. He did not rewrite the Force. But he taught Sidious how to do both. As the night passed and the sun crept slowly across Coruscant's towers, another day began. Politicians gathered, Jedi debated, citizens worked. None of them noticed what had been lost. None of them realized what had been unleashed. One Sith died, another took his place, and in the stillness of the Force, a whisper lingered. He thought he had conquered death, but death had been waiting inside his own shadow. He died without sound. No alarms, no lightsaber, no final scream through the Force, just a whisper of breath. And the silence that followed was louder than anything Plagueis had ever spoken. He had spent decades orchestrating wars, collapsing economies, breaking the minds of senators, Jedi, and Sith alike. And yet, in the end, his death was not marked by legacy. It was marked by absence. There was no monument, no tomb, no Sith holocron glowing in a secret vault. Not because he was forgotten, but because the one who killed him knew how dangerous remembrance could be. Sidious never spoke his name again. Not in public, not in private, not even in the quiet corridors of his own mind. Because the truth was simple. Plagueis had taught him too well. To erase a shadow, you do not fight it. You consume it, until no one remembers where the shadow ended and you began. Plagueis believed he could master death, that he could stand beside his apprentice as equals, not masters and pawns, but rulers eternal. He thought he would become the first Sith to cheat the rule of two, to break it from within and survive. But he was wrong, because the rule of two is not just a doctrine. It is a wound in the Force. It does not allow for coexistence. It ends only when one Sith stands, and one lies beneath. Still, for all his arrogance, Plagueis had not lost completely. His death was not the end of his plan. It was the beginning of someone else's. Because while his body faded into the dark, his ideas did not. They bled into Sidious, into the Clone Wars, into the Jedi Purge, into Anakin Skywalker, into the Empire. And so the question remains, did he fail? Or did he simply become the quiet hand that reshaped the galaxy even from the grave? Even Sidious, in moments of solitude, wondered. Not aloud, never aloud. But the memory of Plagueis lingered in the throne room of the Death Star, in the echo of every clone, marching to war, in the quiet fear behind every Jedi's eyes, that something unnatural, something ancient, had touched the future. Plagueis had always said, the Force can be bent, shaped, directed. And maybe he did bend it just enough to ripple outward, even after death. Maybe the silence after his passing wasn't emptiness. Maybe it was the sound of something else beginning, something far worse. Because in the end, what Sidious killed was not just a Sith Lord. It was a voice. And voices echo. When the Clone Wars began, few knew what had truly been set in motion. To the galaxy, it was politics, betrayal, and chaos. But beneath that, far beneath, was something colder, something older. Plagueis had never wanted open war. He wanted slow corruption, subtle strings. But Sidious had learned something deeper from his master. How to turn chaos into clarity, how to hide a dagger beneath a treaty. The Clone Wars were not a failure of diplomacy. They were the perfect outcome of Sith engineering. And every explosion, every vote, every soldier raised carried the fingerprints of Darth Plagueis. It was Plagueis who taught Sidious to play both sides, to fund both armies, to whisper to both the Republic and the Separatists, to turn the Jedi into generals, and then blame them for becoming warriors. In every strategy the Chancellor approved, there was a lesson Plagueis once whispered in the dark. If you want to kill the Jedi, make them forget what they are. The Jedi Council, once the guardians of peace, now commanded fleets. They issued kill orders, they justified war, and with each compromise, they stepped further away from the light. Plagueis never lived to see it. But his dream was unfolding. And yet, even as Sidious rose, even as the galaxy shifted, there were nights when the Emperor sat in silence and felt something behind him. Not footsteps, not a ghost, but a presence, a knowing. Because in the vast machinery of the war, the clones, the deception, the Jedi deaths, there were ideas too precise, too cruel, too perfect. They did not feel like Sidious alone. They felt inherited, and maybe that was the final cruelty, that even in death, Plagueis had not left the war. He had become the war. His voice echoed in the orders that birthed millions of soldiers, in the removal of names and identities, in the turning of life into numbers. Camino. Order 66. The Jedi archives corrupted. None of it bore his name, but all of it bore his method. Because Sidious may have ruled the Empire, but the idea of the Empire came from a voice long buried. A voice that had once asked, what if a Sith could live forever? Not in body, but in consequence. Darth Plagueis never had a son, no lineage, no blood heir. But he didn't need one. His legacy was written not in family, but in flesh, woven into the cells of a child born decades after his death. The child's name was Anakin Skywalker. When Sidious first sensed him, he did not understand what he had found. Only that the boy was powerful, unnaturally so, born of no father, conceived, as the Jedi claimed, by the Force itself. But there were whispers in the archives, hidden even from the Council. Rumors of experiments once conducted by a Muan Sith Lord who sought to influence the will of the Force to create life through midi-chlorians. It was said that Plagueis had failed, that he had gone too far, that the Force itself had retaliated. But if that were true, then Anakin's birth was not divine. It was an act of vengeance. The Force had answered Plagueis's blasphemy not by destroying his work but by twisting it, by giving birth to a child who would one day destroy everything he built. Sidious never spoke this truth aloud, but deep down, he knew. He could feel it in the boy's presence, the echo of something ancient and familiar. It was Plagueis, in the tone of his defiance, in the shape of his destiny. Every time Sidious looked into Anakin's eyes, he saw his master staring back. The irony was complete. The apprentice who killed his master was now raising the master's unintentional creation as his own weapon. And so, through Anakin, Plagueis lived on. Not as a ghost, but as a flaw inside the very heart of the Empire. Because Anakin was everything Plagueis sought and everything Sidious feared. He was life created without consent, power born without permission, the proof that the Force could still act on its own. For years, Sidious believed he had bent Anakin to his will, but he had not. He had merely delayed the inevitable. Because you cannot control what was born from rebellion itself. In time, the student would betray the master again, just as it had always been. Plagueis's voice, silent for decades, would return in another form. In a flash of lightning, in a breath that turned to rage, in a son who would redeem his father by destroying the emperor he once served. Sidious believed the rule of two had ended with him, but it never ended. It only changed its shape. Because every apprentice who kills his master inherits not just power, but the infection of ambition. And that infection began long before Sidious, long before Bane, long before the modern Sith even had a name. It began with one Muon scientist who believed he could outthink the Force. He failed, and yet in failure he created the one thing he sought most, a legacy that could not die. The Jedi thought he was gone. The Sith no longer spoke his name, and in the libraries of Munilinst, even the records of Hego Damask had been erased. But Darth Plagueis had never needed memory. He had needed only momentum. Because what he created did not end when he died. It moved forward quietly, invisibly, like a virus woven into the fate of the galaxy. In Sidious, his teachings became policy. In Anakin, his experiments became prophecy. In the Empire, his vision became structure. He never ruled the galaxy, but everything the galaxy became was shaped by him. Every law passed by the Senate was paid for with his credits. Every world that fell into the war was mapped by his economists. Every clone born for battle was the result of his funding, his genetics, his silent push behind the curtain. Even his death was not an end but a condition. Because Sidious had to believe he was free, he had to think he had surpassed his master. Only then would he become the next link in the chain, the next vessel, the next mistake. And so, the voice of Plagueis remained unspoken but never unheard. In the cracks of the Death Star, in the fear of Yoda's last breath, in the whisper of Padme's heart as it stopped for no medical reason. It was there, watching, waiting. Because Sith do not leave tombs behind. They leave ideas, and ideas do not die. They hide. In the mind of a senator, in the hand of a child, in the shadow of a clone. In the silence between breaths on a world where Jedi once stood, Darth Plagueis may have been killed, but the galaxy kept dreaming of him. In every war, in every betrayal, in every fall from light to darkness, his pattern repeated. Not by design, not by prophecy, but because Plagueis had shown the way. A path through science, through money, through control. The Sith had always been warriors, but he made them rulers. He gave them tools to bend, not just the Force but time, biology, and fate itself. And while Sidious reached for immortality through lightning and fear, Plagueis had already achieved it. Not in body, but in consequence. That was the final truth. the one Sidious never understood. Plagueis didn't need to live forever. He only needed the galaxy to live the way he wanted. And so, he did. Even in silence, even in death. The Republic fell. The Jedi were purged. The Chosen One was broken. And the shadow that passed through it all was never named, but always there. Darth Plagueis the Wise, the Sith who ruled without a throne, the master whose student ruled the stars and still never escaped him. He was the whisper behind every lie, the breath behind every scream, the root of every choice that led the galaxy into fire. Some believe he was defeated, others believe he returned. But those who truly understand know the darker truth. He never needed to come back, because he never left.